If we now collect the actual, often ironical, results of so much noble struggle, we get a clear but exaggerated picture of our American society. Slums of engineering, boondoggling production, chaotic congestion, tribes of middlemen, basic city functions squeezed out, garden cities for children, indifferent workmen, underprivileged on a dole, empty belonging without nature or culture, front politicians, no patriotism, an empty nationalism bound for a cataclysmically disastrous finish, wise opinions swamped, enterprise sabotaged by monopoly, prejudice, rising religion odios, the popular culture debased, science specialized, science secret, the average man inept, youth idle and truant, youth sexually suffering and sexually obsessed, youth without goals, poor schools. This picture is not unjust, but it is, again, exaggerated, for it omits, of course, all the positive factors and the ongoing successes. We have a persisting grand culture. There is a steady advance of science, scholarship, and the fine arts, a steady improvement in health and medicine, an economy of abundance, and in many ways, a genuine civil peace and a stubborn affirming of democracy. And most of all, there are the remarkable resilience and courage that belong to human beings. Also, the Americans, for all their folly and conformity, are often thrillingly sophisticated and impatient of hypocrisy. Yet there is one grim actuality that even this exaggerated picture does not reveal: the creeping defeatism and surrender by default to the organized system of the state and semi-monopolies. International business machines and organized psychologists, we have seen, effectually determine the method of school examinations and personnel selection. As landlords, Webb and Knapp and Metropolitan Life decide what our domestic habits should be, and as civic developers, they plan communities, even though their motive is simply a long-term modest profit on investment, while millions are ill-housed. The good of General Motors and the nation are inseparable, says Secretary Wilson, even though the cars are demonstrably ruinous for the cities, ruinous for the young, etc. Madison Avenue and Hollywood not only debauch their audiences, but they preempt the means of communication, so nothing else can exist. With only occasional flagrant breaches of legality, the increasingly interlocking police forces and the FBI make people cowed and speechless. That Americans can allow this kind of thing instead of demolishing it with a blow of the paw like a strong lion is the psychology of missed revolutions. 9. For our positive purposes in this book, it is the middle parts of our paragraphs that warrant study, the failures, the falling short, the compromises. Imagine that these modern radical positions had been more fully achieved. We should have a society where a premium is placed on technical improvement and on the engineering style of functional simplicity and clarity, where the community is planned as a whole, with an organic integration of work, living, and play, where buildings have the variety of their real functions with the uniformity of the prevailing technology, where a lot of money is spent on public goods, where workers are technically educated and have a say in management, where no one drops out of society and there is an easy mobility of classes, where production is primarily for use, where social groups are laboratories for solving their own problems experimentally, where democracy begins in the town meeting and a man seeks office only because he has a program, where regional variety is encouraged and there is pride in the republic, and young men are free of conscription, where all feel themselves citizens of the universal republic of reason, where it is the policy to give an adequate voice to the unusual and unpopular opinion, and to give a trial and a market to new enterprise, where people are not afraid to make friends, where races are factually equal, where vocation is sought out and cultivated as God-given capacity to be conserved and embellished, and where the church is the spirit of its congregation, where ordinary experience is habitually scientifically assayed by the average man, where it is felt that the suggestion of reason is practical, and speech leads to the corresponding action, where the popular culture is a daring and passionate culture, where children can make themselves useful and earn their own money, where their sexuality is taken for granted, where the community carries on its important adult business and the children fall in at their own pace, and where education is concerned with fostering human powers as they develop in the growing child. In such an utopian society, as was aimed at by modern radicals but has not eventuated, it would be very easy to grow up. There would be plenty of objective, worthwhile activities for a child to observe, fall in with, do, learn, improvise on his own. That is to say, it is not the spirit of modern times that makes our society difficult for the young. It is that that spirit has not sufficiently realized itself. In this light, the present plight of the young is not surprising. In the rapid changes, people have not kept enough in mind that the growing young also exist, and the world must fit their needs. So instead, we have the present phenomena of excessive attention to the children as such, in psychology and suburbs, and coping with juvenile delinquency as if it were an entity. Adults fighting for some profoundly conceived fundamental change naturally give up, exhausted, when they have achieved some gain that makes life tolerable again and seems to be the substance of their demand. But to grow up, the young need a world of finished situations and society made whole again. 10. Indeed, the bother with the above little utopian sketch is that many adults would be restive in such a stable modern world if it were achieved. They would say, "It is a fine place for growing boys." I agree with this criticism. I think the case is as follows. Every profound new proposal of culture or institution invents and discovers a new property of human nature. Henceforth, it is going to be in these terms that a young fellow will grow up and find his identity and his task. So if we accumulate the revolutionary proposals of modern times, we have named the goals of modern education. We saw that it was the aim of progressive education to carry this program through. But education is not life. The existing situation of a grown man is to confront an uninvented and undiscovered present. Unfortunately, at present, he must also try to perfect his unfinished past. This bad inheritance is part of the existing situation and must be stoically worked through. 11. Let me repeat the proposition of this chapter. It is the missed revolutions of modern times, the falling short and the compromises that add up to the conditions that make it hard for the young to grow up in our society. The existing local community, region, and nation is the real environment of the young. Conversely, we could define community spirit and patriotism as the conviction in which it is possible to grow up. An independent and not too defeated adult confronts a broader historical, international, and cosmic scene as his environment for action. Modern times have been characterized by fundamental changes occurring with unusual rapidity. These have shattered tradition, but often have not succeeded in creating a new whole community. We have no recourse to going back. There is nothing to go back to. If we are to have a stable and whole community in which the young can grow to manhood, we must painfully perfect the revolutionary modern tradition we have. This stoical resolve is, paradoxically, a conservative proposition aiming at stability and social balance. For often, it is not a question of making innovations, but of catching up and restoring the right proportions. But no doubt, in our runaway, one-sided way of life, the proposal to conserve human resources and develop human capacities has become a radical innovation. Right proportion cannot be restored by adding a few new teachers formally equivalent to the growth in population. Probably we need 1 million new minds and more put to teaching. Even Dr. Conant says that we must nearly double our present annual expenditure on education for teaching alone, not counting plant and the central schools he wants. And this does not take into account essentially new fields, such as making sense of adult leisure. It must be understood that with the increase in population and crowding, the number and variety of human services increase disproportionately, and the laissez-faire areas, both geographical and social, decrease. Therefore, the units of human service, such as school classes or the clientele of a physician and even political districts, ought to be made smaller to avoid the creation of masses, mass teaching, mass medicine, mass psychotherapy, mass penology, mass politics. Yet our normal schools and medical schools cannot cope with even the arithmetic increase. Right proportion requires reversing the goal in vocational guidance, from fitting the man to the machine and chopping him down to fit, to finding the opportunity in the economy that brings out the man, and if you can't find such an opportunity, make it. This involves encouraging new small enterprises and unblocking and perhaps underwriting invention. Again, if at present production is inhuman and stupid, it is that too few minds are put to it. This can be remedied by giving the workman more voice in production and the kind of training to make that voice wise. Probably right proportion involves considerable decentralizing and increasing the rural-urban ratio. Certainly, it involves transforming the scores of thousands of neglected small places, hopelessly dull and same, into interesting villages that someone could be proud of. A lot of the booming production has got to go into publicly useful goods, proportionate to the apparently forgotten fact that it is on public grounds, because of public investment and the growth of population, that private wealth is produced and enjoyed. We have to learn again what city man always used to know, that belonging to the city, to its squares, its market, its neighborhoods, and its high culture is a public good. It is not a field for investment to yield a long-term modest profit. A proportionate allocation of public funds, again, is not likely to devote more money to escape roads convenient for automobiles than to improving the city center. If I may make a pleasant suggestion, we could underwrite a handsome program for serious adult leisure by a 10% luxury tax on new cars. It would yield over $1 billion. Since prosperity itself has made it more difficult for the underprivileged immigrant to get started, right proportion requires devoting all the more money and ingenuity to helping him find himself and get started. In such cases, by the way, ingenuity and friendly aid are more important than money, as some of our settlement houses in New York have beautifully demonstrated. And some way will have to be found, again, for a man to be decently poor, to work for a subsistence without necessarily choosing to involve himself in the total high-standard economy. One way of achieving this would be directly producing subsistence goods in distinction from the total economy. In arts and letters, there is a right balance between the customary social standard and creative novelty, and between popular entertainment and aesthetic experience. Then, to offset Hollywood and Madison Avenue, we must have hundreds of new little theaters, little magazines, and journals of dissenting opinion with means of circulation, because it is only in such that new things can develop and begin to win their way in the world. It is essential that our democratic legislatures and public spokesmen be balanced by more learned and honorable voices that, as in Britain, can thoughtfully broach fundamental issues of community plan, penal code, morality, cultural tone, with some certainty of reaching a public forum and some possibility of being effective. For there is no other way of getting the best to lead, to have some conviction and even passionate intensity, to save America from going to managers, developers, and politicians by default. Certainly right proportion, in a society tightly organized and conformist, requires a vast increase in the jealous safeguard of civil liberties, to put the fear of God back into local police, district attorneys, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Here is a program of more than a dozen essential changes, all practicable, all difficult. A wiser and more experienced author could suggest a dozen more. 12. Let me expand one of these, making sense of adult leisure. What are the present goals of the philosophers of leisure? For instance, the National Recreation Association, and now imagine those goals achieved. There would be 100 million adults who have cultured hobbies to occupy their spare time. Some expert on the flute, some with do-it-yourself kits, some good at chess and Go, some square dancing, some camping out and enjoying nature, and all playing various athletic games. Leaf through the entire catalog of the National Recreation Association, take all the items together, apply them to 100 million adults, and there is the picture. This costs at present $40 billion a year, according to the guess of Robert Coughlin in Life. The philosophy of leadership, correspondingly, is to get people to participate. Everybody must belong. Now, even if all these people were indeed getting deep personal satisfaction from these activities, this is a dismaying picture. It doesn't add up to anything. It isn't important. There is no ethical necessity in it, no standard. One cannot waste 100 million people that way. The error is in the NRA's basic concept of recreation. Let me quote from a recent editorial in Recreation. Recreation is any activity participated in merely for the enjoyment it affords. The rewards of recreational activities depend upon the degree to which they provide outlets for personal interests. Outlets again, as in the governor's prescription for the juvenile delinquents. But enjoyment is not a goal. It is a feeling that accompanies important ongoing activity. Pleasure, as Freud said, is always dependent on function. From the present philosophy of leisure, no new culture can emerge. What is lacking is worthwhile community necessity. As the serious leisure, the Sigma Chi Lambda Eta of the Athenians had communal necessity, whether in the theater, the games, the architecture and festivals, or even the talk. That we find it hard to think in these terms is a profound sign of our social imbalance. Yet we do not need, as Dr. Douglas claimed in the passage we quoted above, a new ethics, a new aesthetic. For the activities of serious leisure are right there, glaring in our communities to avoid shame and achieve grandeur. But the question is, if there is little interest, honor, or manliness in the working part of our way of life, can we hope for much in the leisure part? 13. The best exposition of what I have been trying to say in this chapter is the classic of conservative thinking, Coleridge's On the Constitution of the Church and State. His point in that essay is simply this: in order to have citizens, you must first be sure that you have produced men. There must therefore be a large part of the commonwealth specifically devoted to cultivating freedom and civilization, and especially to the education of the young growing up. Conclusion. 1. It is normal for sober adult citizens to take the wildness and absurdities of the younger generation tolerantly and with a touch of envious admiration, just as those adults who are more inhibited and insecure always must deplore them and feel that things are going to the dogs. In solidly established Augustan ages, such as the period in England between 1688 and the Industrial Revolution, the excesses of well-brought-up young men are even socially obligatory under the style of sowing wild oats. In outrageously bad ages, such as the period in Russia during the last half of the 19th century, rebellious youth is esteemed as the hoped-for agent of change. These attitudes all make sense and apply in our times too. In this book, I have no doubt been variously tolerant, envying, deploring, approving, and esteeming. It is not an interesting question whether or not our present youth problems are fundamentally different from those of other times, whether or not they will blow over, whether the beats are a fad and the delinquents no worse than in 1850. What I have tried to show, rather, is this: that such problems, by their form and content, test and criticize the society in which they occur. The burden of proof as to who is wrong does not rest with the young but always with the system of society. Some societies bear it easily. Our society is not outrageously bad, but it is far from adequate, and it stands the test poorly. A poor showing is proved by the fact that young people are paid attention to as a group, as they must be if they are importantly in the right, and there are fathers and sons, or flaming youth, or youth problems. In America, our flaming youth and youth problems have occurred after great wars, for then the adults really disgraced themselves. Appendix F contrasts these two periods. 2. We must distinguish between two kinds of special attention paid these days by the Americans to their young. The first is the effect of the disappointment and resignation of the older generation. It is a kind of Lear complex. They themselves have failed to be men and women. They are therefore both timid and guilty before the young. With respect to children, this adult resignation results in the child-centered suburb and the emphasis on psychology. With regard to the adolescents, it appears as a craving for youth for oneself, to act like youth, to give in to youth, meaning by youth the teenage foolishness that still has some vitality. This comes to the $11 billion sales to teenagers, for what can these kids think up except to imitate the customs of their elders? Naturally, once there is such a vast market, sales-minded publicists give most earnest attention to youth. This kind of youth is far from problematic. It seems that it will be even more worthless than its parents, and God pity us. But the second kind of attention is that claimed by the problematic who are importantly in the right. They are problematic because they try to vomit up the poisonous mores. They won't eat them, they are sick because they have eaten too many of them. And they are in the right because they are obviously in the right, everybody knows it. 3. Flaming youth of the 20s had salutary effects. It speeded the sexual revolution and the new permissive psychology of child care. It put the seal on the new simple prose. Our present round of youth problems has been dampened and delayed by war anxiety and disillusionment, yet even so it has already had positive successes. The young people have latched on to the movement in art that is the strongest in our generation, the so-called action painting or New York school. In music, the matching numbers are the percussive atonalists like Verse or the musique concrete made of the tapes. There is an action architecture. Artaud preached an action theater. I have tried to show that this disposition to go back to the material elements and the real situation is intrinsic and spontaneous in the art action and poetry action of some of the young groups. This means that they are not off the main track. It can be said that this action art lacks content. It does not carry enough humanity. I think this is true. But it is just its eschewing of a stereotyped or corrupt content, while nevertheless affirming the incorruptible content of the artist's own action. That is its starved and brave humanity, a step beyond the nihilism of Dada, a beginning. Young people have hit, too, on rituals of expression in face-to-face groups, and in provoking the public audience as a face-to-face group that are clearly better than the canned popular culture or the academic culture. But these things are in line with what the best sociologists and community planners are also after. It is a move against an army and the lonely crowd. Naturally, it is drunken and threadbare. The English angry young men, again, have specialized in piercing the fraudulent speech of public spokesmen and in trying to force them to put up or shut up. They have learned to cry out shame. When 1 million Americans, and not only young men, can learn to do this, we shall have a most salutary change. Disaffected young groups in America, England, and France have also flatly taken direct action in race relations. They present racial brotherhood and miscegenation as a fait accompli. More generally, all the recent doings of problematic youth, whether in the middle class or among the underprivileged juvenile delinquents, have had a stamp of at least partly springing from some existent situation, whatever it is, and of responding with direct action, rather than keeping up appearances and engaging in role-playing. There is also among them a lot of phony role-playing, but no more than in present acceptable society, and rather less than in the average young man or adolescent who has a line. I think that the existential reality of beat, angry, and delinquent behavior is indicated by the fact that other, earnest young fellows who are not themselves disaffected and who are not phony are eager to hear about them and respect them. One cannot visit a university without being asked 100 questions about them. Finally, some of these groups are achieving a simpler fraternity, animality, and sexuality than we have had, at least in America, in a long, long time. 4. This valuable program is in direct contrast to the mores of what we have in this book been calling the organized system. Its role-playing, its competitiveness, its canned culture, its public relations, and its avoidance of risk and self-exposure. That system and its mores are death to the spirit, and any rebellious group will naturally raise a contrasting banner. Now the organized system is very powerful and in its full tide of success, apparently sweeping everything before it in science, education, community planning, labor, the arts, not to speak of business and politics, where it is indigenous. Let me say that we of the previous generation who have been sickened and enraged to see earnest and honest effort and humane culture swamped by this muck, are heartened by the crazy young allies, and we think that perhaps the future may make more sense than we dared hope. Appendices. Appendix A. December 12, 1959. Commissioner of Education. Albany. Dear Dr. Allen, I understand that the case of James Worley of Croton Falls has come to you for review. Allow me to say something in his behalf. In content, his original protesting action, refusing to prepare a 2-week lesson plan, seems to me beyond doubt correct. I myself have taught every age from 10-year-olds through PhD candidates and older adults. It has been my universal experience that formal preparation of a lesson plan beyond the next hour or two is not only unrealistic, but can be positively harmful and rigidifying, for it interferes with the main thing, the contact between the teacher and his class. Worley's disagreement with the administrative order is, to me, simply evidence that he is a good teacher and knows what the right teaching relation is. A teacher who would seriously comply with the order would likely be a poor teacher. Our model must always be the Socratic dialogue, for the aim is not to convey some information, but to get the information across as part of the student's nature and second nature, so he can make an individual and creative use of it. On the other hand, if the compliance is not serious, it is a waste of time. And as you know well, teachers are burdened with paperwork, much of which is absolutely necessary. In form, his protest was certainly insubordinate, but obviously each of us has the moral and social duty to draw the line somewhere against obedience to error. Worley has drawn it at a very crucial point, namely, where the order interferes with the right performance of the job. In the end, this is the sacred and final obligation of every professional, to do the work and to defend the conditions under which the work can be done well. The issue is of immense importance. Our country is being systematically emasculated by a sickening waste of human resources. The efforts of a doctor, content to salvage some scientific talent, are ludicrously inadequate to the main problem, which is precisely the difficulties created by our social relations that keep the inventor from his materials, the workman from honest labor, the teacher from his students and subject matter, and the artist from his public. We cannot afford to throw away good teachers to save face for mistaken administrators. It is the glory of good administration precisely to smooth the path for objective work to proceed. Therefore, I urge you to intervene in this case and reinstate Mr. Worley. Copy to Gov. Rockefeller sincerely. Paul Goodman, New York City. The appeal of Mr. Worley was rejected by the commissioner, who said that, though he was much in the right, he ought to have acted through the proper channels. Appendix B. New Theatre and the Unions 1. I want to discuss a mistaken policy of certain theatre craft unions and suggest a remedy. The matter has an importance in itself, because in recent years there has been a growth in new theatre off-Broadway that may, if it is encouraged, come to some real living theatre. The union policy has been a discouragement, almost as bad as the unavailability of real estate, and it has been attacked with the usual jeering debaters' points by the tribe unsympathetic to unionism as such. But especially I want to discuss this question because it is, in parvo, a remarkably apt case of what is becoming the chief problem of our contemporary culture: how to live and breathe creatively in a society whose technology and organizations unavoidably make for conformity. Without mentioning names, let me tell the story concretely in a case where I happen to know the facts. Here is a company devoted to new theatre that has now for nearly 10 years kept at work under arduous conditions, in larger or smaller quarters as it could get, or build them by their own and their friends' voluntary labor. The nucleus of the company is a group of theatre people, actors, musicians, dancers, and writers, some of them of great reputation, who have all of them, for from 10 to 50 years, given themselves, often financially unrewarded, to the development of our modern art. They are a constellation comparable, for example, to the fine group that cooperated as the Provincetown Players. Nobody would question that they are devoted to the growth of theatre and not to making money. They try to make enough to sustain themselves. Now, in casting their productions, they want to employ equity actors. Many of those who voluntarily built the place they now occupy are equity actors, and naturally, having laid the bricks, they want to act. By and large, professional actors belong to equity, and most of the best actors are professional, so you want to cast them. Now the situation among actors is as follows. 1. About 95% are chronically unemployed. 2. Actors have a kind of hunger, a need to act. 3. Understanding this, equity permits its members to work, in certain circumstances, for as little as $40 a week. Regarding this figure, I guess, as pretty near the decent subsistence minimum that a person must have, no matter what his enthusiasm or other satisfaction in the work. When then this company sends out a casting call in the professional journals, there are hundreds of responses from actors eager for any part, hoping to advance their careers by appearing and getting notices, and many of them glad to work in a cultured, non-commercial atmosphere on intrinsically more interesting material where they can learn something. That is, small non-commercial theaters of high standards and trained professional actors are mutually useful to one another, and equity recognizes this obvious fact. The professional theater, however, is organized also on the principle that equity players may not act in a non-union play, a play whose staff is not union. In my opinion, this principle is a correct one, for reasons I shall briefly mention in a moment. But unfortunately, it works out as follows. When the director of the company goes to the various craft and staff unions to get a countersignature to allow equity players to play, he is told that he must employ one union stagehand at $137 a week, one union press agent at $145, one union scene designer at $40 per day, for at least 3 days, and whenever there is to be a little live music. There must be union musicians at similar figures. All this amounts to a financial burden out of all proportion to the company's other expenses and to the profits they expect or even hope for. It is quite unfeasible. The theater has less than 175 seats. Some are kept at $1, so students can come, figure it out. In the case here, the burden happens to be particularly galling because the director himself is a gifted and well-known scenic designer. Like all other artistic groups, they prefer to couch their press releases and other public relations in their own style. The work done by stagehands is what almost everybody connected with a little theater is skilled at and does with pleasure. And everywhere in integral theater, there is a need for live music. It can never be omitted, and canned music is deathly. The unions are inflexible in their demands. The company cannot fulfill them. In this impasse, there is at once generated enormous heat and idiotic remarks. If you don't have the money, stay out of the theater, says a distinguished functionary of one of the unions. You're a painter, he says to the director, why don't you stick to pictures? On the other side, the equity actors connected with the company are in a rage and about to tear up their cards. Those who are politically hep point out that organized labor has fallen into the hands of racketeers. And the paranoid demonstrate that there is a conspiracy among the unions, the critics, and the owners of theater real estate to prevent anything new and better from happening. Necessity of the unions. Let me insist that the principle of total theater unionism, including equity, seems to me to be correct. This is simply because of the nature of the theater arts and crafts. Our city abounds in people of artistic talent, eager to exercise their separate talents. By disposition, such people are freelancers, and the state of serious art in our society is such that, until they make a lot of money, free artists have little status or security and cannot easily maintain their rights and dignity. As a group, then, they are peculiarly subject to being taken advantage of and exploited by producers who can give them any work at all. And when taken advantage of, they act effectually as scabs and lower the standards of honest employment. That is, it is precisely the intrinsic virtues of the talented, their hunger to work and their solitariness, that make them socially weak and liable to lower social standards. Poor gifted musicians, painters, poets, dancers, and actors are severally weak indeed. By insisting, even inflexibly and intransigently, on their union, one can give them collectively some strength. What then? The principle of unionism lays an unbearable burden on any new non-commercial company. It works to the disadvantage of equity actors, and yet the principle itself is a necessary one. Nevertheless, dispassionately considered, the solution to this dilemma is easy. Briefly, if we carefully consider the nature of theater, we shall see that new theater in general cannot make money and must overcome great obstacles in order to exist. And yet eventually, it must in turn become immensely popular and make a lot of money, becoming the exciting novelty in commercial theater. The process has 2 steps, and mindful of their own interests, the unions must have a dual attitude, positively to foster the new and non-commercial, and to protect their standards in the commercial. And there ought to be a definite rule to mark the passage from the first stage of the process to the second. There is no doubt that it is a vague or clear understanding of this that, in part, has led equity to its own more flexible policy. The nature of new theatre. Reflect a moment on the following commonplace observations. 1. The theatre is a fine art for an immediate present public, and it is also a collaboration of many skills. Therefore, theatre requires a large social effort, setting many people in motion, and a certain amount of social capital. Not necessarily a large capital compared, say, with architecture, where the very medium is expensive, but an even larger social effort than architecture. 2. Radically new theatre, like any new art, cannot expect a mass popular response, for it presents what is unfamiliar and is even actively resisted as meaningless, perverse, or dangerous. The sign of successful new theatre is that the audience is torn between fascination and the impulse to walk out in disgust. The anxiety of new theatre is greater than with other new art because theatre demands a response in public, and its medium is exceptionally close to the animal and social behavior of life. The same anxiety, by the way, is felt even more by the players than by public, as anyone who has rehearsed new theatre with conventional actors can testify. Therefore, it is only from small, intensely personally involved groups and a small public of the like-minded that we can expect new theatre to emerge. 3. But conversely, once a new theatrical advance has been made, it is likely to become immensely popular, for it is shared excitement. A new advance in some other art need not become popular in this way, for, although humanly important, it may be specialist and learned. But theatre art is common and simple. 4. So-called little theatre groups, making a great social effort and overcoming great obstacles, from real estate to interpersonal relations, and with little income to ease the path, are driven by an artistic fatality into the daring and the radically new. They are not dilettantes or amateurs. Their aim is to achieve at least the excitement of the big professional entertainment. Otherwise, why bother? Yet their means are limited. Therefore, they explore new ways of handling limited means to get as much meaning as if they had extensive means. This creates startling effects. Or alternately, they make daring simplifications, and this creates startling effects. Let me sum up these familiar propositions in a formula. The task of new theatre is to find out and invent what must be unpopular and yet will soon be immensely popular. It is in this thorny task that it makes a great social effort against many obstacles. Naturally, people are not too attracted by this prospect. Like most of the off-Broadway theatre at present, people prefer the easier task of performing modern classics, the new theatre of 1 or 2 generations ago, of importing European successes that are exotically safe, or of giving museum-like revivals, more properly the function of university players and dedicated amateurs. All that is off-Broadway and fairly non-commercial, but it is not new theatre. I do not mean, by the way, that the company I am discussing is a pure model of new theatre, but it is one of the best of a bad lot, and nothing is perfect here below. A proposal to the unions. Bearing all this in mind, would not the wise, the statesmanlike attitude of the unions be for them to say something like this: "New theatre, go to it and we hope you succeed. For if you do, there will be a new kind of immensely popular and paying theatre, and if you don't, there will be only a dying theatre." The policy of equity, distinguishing a commercial and a non-commercial theatre, is a sound one, but we, of course, are in a different situation from the actors. For our carpenters, electricians, press agents, musicians, and so forth, there is no psychological necessity to perform in theatres. Unemployed in the theatre, they could get other jobs, and we see no reason, therefore, to lower their standards in any way. But as for the actors, directors, and creative artists of scene, word, movement, and music, who need the theatre public to exercise their talents, we shall not stand in their way. On the other hand, as soon as you free artists begin to get into the money, then the situation is entirely different, and we have a right to take our place in the enterprise and exact our fair shares. We have the right because all wealth is social wealth, produced by society as a whole, and it must be apportioned according to the rules that society has come to at the present time, to achieve which we in labor have fought and suffered much. Therefore we shall, by some reasonable rule of thumb, set a figure, perhaps an income figure, perhaps a profit ratio, at which we think your free art has entered the cash nexus, a dividing line, at which the excitingly unpopular is beginning to be the immensely popular. And when any of your enterprises crosses that line, it must be total union. We reserve the right to examine your qualifications and check your books, and so you affiliate with us as your friends and pay a nominal dues. This, I submit, is the wise, the statesmanlike attitude that loses nothing for the unions and that encourages the growth of theater. It can set a definite rule that fits the real nature of the case, unlike the present abstract policy or alternative non-policy of making exceptions, of sometimes being intransigent and sometimes shutting the eyes, of acting de facto as powerful critics and censors far beyond their competence. Instead, it gives the theater crafts a noble and protective role in the growth of the culture of the people. A new responsibility. I said at the outset that this small question contains a great question. Without further ado, let me generalize. The case is with us in America that, by and large, vast organizations of state, capital, production, labor, communications, education, urbanism, etc., etc., have preempted the means of life. This is currently inevitable and doubtless in many ways desirable, though not so unquestionably desirable as most people think. When everything is done according to a certain pattern, it is hard to imagine how some other pattern could work at all. At the same time, it is resulting in a conformity that is by now inane and boring and will soon be dangerous, for nothing revitalizing can occur in an organizational plan, and when something occurs outside the plan, it may not have space to grow. All this has become a familiar complaint. I want to suggest simply that with their power, these organizations have acquired a new, strange, and troublesome responsibility to limit the exercise of their power more intelligently than they are accustomed to stand out of the way in order that there can be a future also for themselves. Appendix C. The freedom to go to. I haven't read John Keats' The Insolent Chariots, but I can see that it and Manfred MacArthur's critique of it provide an excellent example of a dual approach in recent sociology that is inevitable because we have a dual economy that is being analyzed. We have one society but two kinds of money, hard money and soft money, as somebody has called them. I don't know who first. Hard money is the old-fashioned money that you really work for, that is measured by labor time and surplus value, and that applies on the market, including the market for labor, according to an iron law of wages. Soft money is mad money or sailor money that has at present, however, skyrocketed in amount. It is not only given away on TV for personal appearances or for nothing, and has wild salaries on Madison Avenue and in Hollywood, but also, very generally, it pours into fringe benefits, into long vacations with pay giveaway foundations to avoid upper bracket taxes, and even, in an important aspect, social insurance. Naturally, these two monies have different moralities and contrasting moralists like MacArthur and Keats. It is inevitable that we have these two kinds of money because we have a surplus technology. The American machine is working at a small fraction of its productivity, and nevertheless, there is a vast surplus of not very desirable wealth produced that simply must be bought up with the soft money. At the same time, there is always a core of subsistence production, for men need bread and shelter, and to get this you have to pay and work for hard money. It does not seem to me sufficient to discuss this unique historical monster in terms of class exploitation, reinvestment, and the falling rate of interest, for the soft money pours to all classes. Yet in power and control, our institutions still do work according to the old economic principles. If you omit the old economic analysis in either your theory or your behavior, you lose out. But if you think and behave in those terms, you are quite out of touch with the facts of life, where bureaucratic and leisure values are paramount. So we have two grand streams of social writing that are fantastically uncommunicating. There are the more academic and post-Marxist analysts of institutions, say Mills or Ben Seligman or Lerner or Lundberg or Farrell, and there are the more journalistic and Freudian analysts of mass culture, like Reisman or Lates or Larrabee and Lines or Spektorsky. Curiously, each group would probably think the other group is rather conservative and neglects the most important levers of social change. I myself don't know, I have not heard, a unified theory that avoids the overdetermination of these dual interpretations, and frankly, I don't see the need for one, so long as each author honestly works at what seems to him to be the main problem. There is plenty of injustice and folly for all. My bias is that Keats and MacArthur both are perfectly right about the automobiles with their huge girth and long tails. I do think, however, that by overlooking the crucial factor of our surplus productivity, the president's anguished outcry that it is un-American not to buy still rings in my soul. Both authors are unfair and uncharitable toward our American problem. Keats seems, I have not read him, to neglect, or not sufficiently to stress, the basic need of the market for fashion and novelty that underlies the pandering to sex, speed, and prestige. There has to be some difference to make the year's model saleable. Put out the most efficient machine you want, and you will still have the problem of how to sell more of it than anybody needs. The experts at this problem are not engineers, but industrial designers. And if you say, stop making the needless cars, then what are you going to do with the productivity of America? I don't mean that there is no answer, but that this is the question. MacArthur, on the other hand, seems to me to be very far from the reality with his puritanical remark about saving money and labor and taking trains and buses. Such Veblen morals apply to an economy of scarcity. Why save the money and labor? To increase the time of leisure. But surveys, e.g., in Larrabee and Meyerson's anthology Mass Leisure, show that it is precisely for leisure that precisely a workingman's car is his chief salvation from absolute inanition. What if the car stands idle outside the plant because the lonely half-hour drive to and from work is the man's most precious hour of the day at either work or leisure? The car is his share in the superabounding wealth. What share would this author give him? On sunny holidays, the workingman will spend long hours fixing the car. It is his freedom to go, though indeed he has nowhere to go, but parks outside the movie. The waste, concludes MacArthur, is caused by lack of responsible overall planning. If by planning he means socialist planning of production and distribution, I think that this is nonsense for the American scene. We are already too efficient for our cultural resources. If, however, he means by planning an organic consideration of means and ends, and the education of the souls of men to be able to use practically the wealth of God and man, then, to his surprise, he will have to begin to think of sex and speed and power and all that. Appendix D. The Freedom to be Academic 3. A special committee at Columbia University has worked for 3 years on the study of academic freedom. And here now are 2 books, by Richard Hofstadter and Walter Metzger, and by Robert MacIver, A History of the Academic Freedom of Inquiry and a Polemical Defense of it against Current Attacks, especially in the social sciences. Inquiry is a term from the pragmatic vocabulary and denotes, roughly, a search to solve problems in the ongoing process of life. Real, not academic problems, though not, of course, narrowly utilitarian problems. The question I want to raise is, to what extent do these authors seriously mean this and mean to defend it? 1. Let me start by taking an annoying and apparently unfair tack. In discussing the case of Bertrand Russell, Professor MacIver says, actually, Russell was dealing forthrightly and sincerely with the most problematic of all areas of social relationship, sex. AF 156, for this is an innocent passing remark in a relatively minor context in the book, but let us suddenly stop at it short and take the sentence at face value. If sexual relations is the most problematic of all areas of inquiry, we should expect that most or very many social scientists are inquiring and teaching here, or at least that the chairmen of departments are falling all over themselves to enlist experts for their staffs in this novel field. In the nature of the case, much that these people are hypothesizing and affirming must be unconventional and socially unacceptable, for in no other area of human behavior is there so unbridgeable a gulf between the officially sanctioned ethics and the socially accepted ways, AF 157, And so there must here be lots of cases of infringement of academic freedom. But no such thing. In the 300 pages of McIlvair's book, 6 are somewhat mostly indirectly concerned with such cases. In the 500 pages of the history, none. Now this is not, I am convinced, because our authors are prejudiced on the subject or afraid of it. Professor McIver, by his tone and remarks, and the few times I have seen him, seems to me sensible and unusually frank. It is because, indeed, the most problematic area is not much an area of inquiry in the universities. Consider the following statement. We know of no cases where an educator, clearly convicted of flagrantly immoral behavior, defended his position by appealing to the principle of academic freedom. Apart from the fact that such defense would be irrelevant, it is certain that his case would receive no support from his institution or from his colleagues. AF 150. If his case would certainly receive no support, the educator would certainly be a fool to press it. But I should like to question the fact that such a defense would be irrelevant. The professor emeritus knows as well as I that it is not sexual immorality that gets teachers sacked, for this is condoned by his peers. It is among the socially accepted ways, but it is the publicity that sometimes accrues. And is this not tantamount to saying that it is not the thing, but the proposition that is being penalized? I know, for instance, of an even closer case, where a teacher in a small progressive college was refused reappointment not because of his delinquent behavior, which was at that place not uncommon and fairly public, but because of his overt claim to the right of it. 5. Could not many such cases quite simply and relevantly be transformed into cases of infringement of academic freedom? But in this problematic area, the theory, in courses in anthropology, is kept far distant from the practice in the ongoing process of life. In my opinion, there is, in our times, a still more problematic area of social relationships. How to cope with war and the complex of issues around it, conscription, nuclear research, international diplomacy. Now in Professor McIver's book, Pacificism is accorded 3 pages. In the history, more interestingly, the cases of the First World War are given a large number of pages, but academic freedom was relatively little affected during the Second World War. Dev. 505. Why was it not? It seems to me that this area and the sexual area have an essential element in common, that in them a strong conviction tends to overt physical, not merely verbal, behavior. That is, the consequences of conviction tend to be dramatic and drastic, e.g., a young man may refuse the draft, a physicist may decline the job. Therefore, these areas are sensitive, and therefore they are not much the objects of inquiry. But the suppression is not proximately extramural but intramural, and it is not forced by the president but by the faculty. I am reasoning somewhat as follows. What is problematic for inquiry is always just beyond the known. In socio-psychological matters, this is an area of confusion and anxiety, and of suppression and repression. Then its exploration must involve interpersonal daring and personal risk, whether or not there is acting out. And in these matters, there is a generic tendency toward acting out. The vital social questions for inquiry are those you are likely to get jailed for messing with. When you are threatened with academic sanctions, it is a good sign that you are on the right track. When you are fired, it is better. But when you are beyond the pale of the academy and will receive no support from your colleagues, then you are possibly touching the philosopher's stone. My point is not that universities are worthless, nor that they should not or cannot be free, but that one cannot seriously regard them as primarily places of inquiry, nor found the case for academic freedom on freedom of inquiry. Of course, it is unrealistic, and it would be uncharitable to object to the dropping of a man who by his theory and practice makes his colleagues anxious. After all, they have to live and breathe too and feel themselves part of a team. The situations with which we are mainly concerned are those in which an influential or power-holding group endeavors to make or succeeds in making its own predilections the official standards of fitness to teach, even though these predilections are particular to their own coterie or social class. Where such groups exercise control, the freedom of education is seriously infringed, and the more independent and freedom-loving members of the institution are likely to suffer most. It is the teacher who sets the highest value on intellectual freedom who is the most obnoxious to the authoritarians. The higher his standard of responsibility, the lower the respect in which they hold him. AF 147. Professor MacIver is here precisely not talking about the faculties of universities, but about their extramural oppressors. Would he not, on reflection, extend the censure to the academic coterie as well? 2. In the main, these books seem to me to be written with a generous integrity and bona fides. They were occasioned, of course, by the recent investigations of communists, and in such discussions, where every nuance of rhetoric and the penumbra of connotations are scrutinized by seasoned experts like Dr. Hook, it is impossible to satisfy anybody. But to my ear, Professor MacIver's sermons, his book has very many pages of long sermons, all ring solid nickel. There is, however, one major topic in treating which there is evident embarrassment, avoidance, difficulties hinted at but not explored, and letting sleeping dogs lie with one eye open. This topic is the relation of knowledge and action. I do not find it credible that the meetings of so experienced a committee did not evoke more philosophic acumen on this subject than is here revealed. On the one hand, Professor MacIver, the historian's less so, lays great stress on the intrinsic worthwhileness of the knowledge of things, the moral and spiritual values of the integrity of mind that steadfastly seeks the truth. AF 14, the excitement of the infinite unknown, the grandeur of standing on the brink. He speaks of this with a religious fervor that makes us believe him, but that also, I fear, takes it out of the context of a discussion of academic freedom at the University of Illinois or even the colleges of the Ivy League. For a seeker blessed and cursed with this much of the Holy Spirit will act accordingly with little help or hindrance from the opinions of presidents or from considerations of his own status and tenure. Disciples will seek him out, and if we do not, so much the worse for us. I think, too, the professor is too sanguine about the possibility of inculcating such an ideal by the ordinary processes of education in colleges. Those who pick it up there have it in them to pick up. On the other hand, all our authors are sold on the pragmatic theory of truth. I do not mean a utilitarian theory, namely, that truth is successful inquiry, and inquiry is an aggressive handling and coping with problems that claim attention. Inquiry is experimental, it intervenes. This implies a close connection of knowledge and action. I am not here speaking of the consequences of inquiry, but of the process itself. In the social sciences, this must mean very often, must it not, sallying beyond the walls into areas that are troublesome, or even to making trouble where all seemed quiet. Certainly, if we consider the masters of the century prior to our generations, whether Kant, Marx, Proudhon, Durkheim, Kropotkin, Sorel, Veblen, Lenin, Freud, Dewey, etc., we are struck by their activism, their actual or projected experimentation on a civic scale. Some of these men are unthinkable as academics, and some had uneasy academic lives. The present-day preoccupation with careful methodology is academically praiseworthy, but it does not lead to intensely interesting propositions. One cannot help feeling that a good part of the current concern with statistics and polling is a way of being active in the area without being actively engaged in the subject matter. There is a good deal of sharpening of tools, but not much agriculture. 6. Professor Metzger eloquently expresses the very point I am trying to make. He is distinguishing the cases of Richard Ely and Edward Bemis, who got into trouble on the theory and practice of labor organization during the 90s. A difference lay in the extent to which Ely and Bemis put their theories into action. For all his talk of the need for concrete reform, Ely's criticisms of the social order tended to be general, not specific, hortatory, not programmatic. For all his warm humanitarianism, he made no intimate contact with the multitude. Only twice in my life, he wrote, have I ever spoken to audiences of working men, and I had always held myself aloof from agitations as something not in my province, something for which I am not adapted. Replying to the charge by Regent Wells that he had acted on his sympathies for labor, he issued a categorical denial. This author of A Friendly History of the Labor Movement denied, at his trial, that he had ever entertained a walking delegate in his home, that he had ever counseled workers to strike, that he had ever threatened an anti-union firm with a boycott, or that he had ever favored the principle of a closed shop. Were these charges true, Ely wrote, they would unquestionably unfit me to occupy a responsible position as an instructor of youth in a great university. These were the words of a very academic reformer, Dev. 433. When Ely was academically vindicated, Burmese wrote to him, "That was a glorious victory for you. I was only sorry that you seemed to show a vigor of denial as to entertaining a walking delegate or counseling strikers as if either were wrong, instead of under certain circumstances, a duty." This was the difference between them. Burmese was not only a partisan, but an active party. The subsequent careers of Ely and Burmese bear out the importance of this point. Ely survived, and in good part renounced, his spoken and written heresies. He remained in a state of academic grace for the rest of his life, taking a post at Northwestern in 1925 and one at Columbia in 1937. Burmese became an academic Ishmael with a reputation as a partisan and a malcontent that he was never able to live down. Except for his brief and ill-starred tenure at Kansas State, he received no further academic appointments. The trustees of the Republic of Learning could inflict on this kind of miscreant the terrible retribution of neglect. Dev. 435. All this is excellently and feelingly said, but it was an issue of 60 years ago, and today in this area a teacher has the right to exercise the same political and civil liberties that are enjoyed by other citizens. Af 238. My bother is that our authors do not extrapolate to present-day areas that must have the same borderline characteristics, and then look a little harder for academic freedom cases, which might look precisely not like academic freedom cases as reported to the American Association of University Professors. On this same topic of knowledge and action, let me raise another difficulty concerning the action of teaching itself and the teacher's responsibility for consequences. Our authors, especially the historians, are frequently scornful of the assumption that a young man yields to the imprint of ideas as easily and uncritically as wax. Dev. 411. They stress, rather, the development of freedom to learn, the opportunity to hear all and pick and choose. I do not think these are, in interesting cases, the real alternatives. The young mind is indeed not passive, but intensely active, and its activity is to crystallize around an ideal, a system of ideas, or a non-familial personality that serves as a parent substitute. Quite apart from sex, the relation of teacher and student is an erotic one, where for the student the attraction is in the excitement, particularly the rebellious excitement of the system of propositions. The more excellent the teacher, the stronger the charismatic effect of his voice. In itself, this is all to the good and is anyway inevitable. It cannot be prevented by doctrinal neutrality, for then the very syntax of neutrality itself becomes adorable. But the attempt to prevent the effect, or to disown responsibility for it, discourages the student and thwarts and embitters the teacher. Is not the situation familiar, that a powerful teacher is regarded by his colleagues, partly in envy and partly in anxiety, as a seducer of his students, and indeed in a conspiracy with them to cast ridicule on themselves? On the other hand, if the strong teacher maintains his reserve, the student, whose needs are more frank, has indeed been rejected and will be either humiliated, disappointed, or angry, depending on his character. My guess is that every college term there is more infringement of the freedom to teach by academic timidity along these lines than in the whole history of cases here treated. Worse, is there not a great waste of natural human resources? Our historians write of the liberation from doctrinal moralism, Dev. 353 ff, the idea that if, e.g., a man is an atheist, he is no doubt a drunkard and unfit to teach. In scientific criticism, the dissociation of the man from his work has become a cardinal principle. This was indeed a great advance, for it heightened the respect for evidence and its accurate presentation and criticism. But I submit that the older theological view had the following merit: that a proposition was fraught with life consequences and had therefore the utmost seriousness. you knew a man by what he professed. I dislike appealing to the romantic and grisly past, but we must bear in mind that the adventure of inquiry has one quality when you are risking disgrace, imprisonment, and even death, and another when you are risking tenure, and quite another when you are risking nothing. Our secular society has great advantages, and even especially for inquiry, but its strong point is not the achievement of vocation or manliness. In his rhetoric of dedication to the truth with a big T, Professor McIlvere is harking back to Spinoza. I wonder if, by and large, he could comfortably use this rhetoric at the faculty club. Maybe I am wrong. To sum up so far, I have tried in a quick and rude way to indicate that the professors fall short in two ways from a standard of inquiry as a phase of an experimental instrumental empiricism. They avoid problematic areas and they do not experiment their hypotheses. Nothing of what I have said, let me remark, applies to more old-fashioned notions of academic freedom of inquiry. For instance, the notion of freedom of dialectic, as exemplified in, say, the Parmenides, where precisely the attachment and non-attachment to any proposition is used as a therapy of the soul, or the Aristotelian freedom of curiosity, aimed at theoria as the highest happiness, or the medieval libertas philosophandi, with its emphasis on disputation to let new air into an accepted world. Or finally, to the Enlightenment's concept of freedom of criticism in the Kantian sense, quo warranto, where the faculty of philosophy serves, as Kant says, as a kind of loyal opposition from the left. All of these base their claim on the proposition that the university is different from, perhaps better than, perhaps a servant of, the rest of the world. 3. I said I had started on an apparently unfair tack. Unfair because I chose an innocent sentence in a minor context, and I have been devoting myself to a matter of logic that Professor McIlvere's book is mostly not about. Now what it is about is the defense of such inquiry as does exist from the current attacks upon it, and specifically and explicitly the communist hunting of the Cold War by many parties, from government agencies to self-constituted vigilantes. Let us then turn briefly to the overt book itself, and see if I can show the relevance of the tack I have been taking. Professor McIlvere's findings on the party and the investigations are the familiar ones of many liberals, and they warrant little fresh discussion here. Summarily, 1. The party communist teacher is unqualified as authoritarian, suppressive, conspiratorial, but this disqualification is based on his activities, not on his theories. Frankly, this distinction is idiotic, since what is a party that does not constrain to action? 2. Past affiliation does not disqualify. 3. A communist, whether he carries a party card or not, may be dismissed if he injects propaganda into his teaching or relationships with students. But conversely, if he teaches a non-controversial subject and is otherwise circumspect, it is better to let him be. 4. Investigation should be done by the faculty, not by the administration or outsiders. 5. Any general investigation to uncover possible communists is wholly undesirable. 6. Loyalty oaths are derogatory, injudicious, and futile. 7. Student organizations should be permitted to invite C.P. speakers. 8. Communist ideas do not disqualify the student. It is useful to distinguish two strata in such a list: judgments that could be called anti-McCarthy and those that are anti-McCarthy. Objections to high-handed and unfair pressures, to informing, to lack of due process, to almost all restraints on freedom of speech. This is simple anti-McCarthyism, and at it are leveled charges of political naivete, of being duped, of not seeing that this is a unique conspiracy, of locking the stable after the horse is gone, and so forth. The response to these charges, in turn, is anti-McCarthyism, granting that there are grounds for the investigations, yet their effect is so productive of fear and withdrawal and inhibition of useful functioning that they weaken the body politic rather than purge it. Thus they play into the hands of the enemy, etc. I think that it is this latter attitude, the prevalence of academic anxiety rather than any righteous indignation, that has prompted the books we are reviewing. For the fact seems to be, at least so it is agreed by all sides in this controversy, except the investigators themselves, that the communist infiltration has been trivial, was never large, and has steadily waned for years, that the furor of investigation has been out of all proportion. The question, then, is why anything so groundless and inappropriate has been met by anything but simple manly rejection, either quiet, derisive, or indignant, depending on one's temperament. Why such big looks? Let me open MacIver at random and quote a few nearby passages. There were evidences that in departments or faculties, here or there, disguised or subtle pressures had been applied to prevent the advancement of such non-conforming members, or against the renewal of their appointments if they lacked tenure. It was not that the scholars who protested against the oath requirements were themselves nonconformists. There were very many good conservatives among them, but whatever their economic viewpoints, alike they apprehended a growing peril to academic freedom. AF 178. No attack seems to be more disruptive than that which emanates from governing boards. They rock the institution. Governing boards are seldom prescient of the effect such edicts produce. Often the disturbance that ensues comes to the governing boards as a complete surprise. Censorial and inquisitorial action on the part of those who themselves are not devoted to the scholar's search for truth is for the true scholar a vital threat. What concerns us here is that the teny warnings and threats and proposals created the most serious apprehensions among leading educators. AF 179. This new exercise of authority by a board over a faculty contained implicit threats against the status of the educator, against the two most vital interests of the profession. The protesting faculty members saw in the new requirement, on the one hand, a threat to academic freedom, on the other, a threat to security of tenure. The pro-oath regents denied that any such threats were involved, but this lack of understanding is one of the too frequent consequences of the lack of rapport that exists in this country between faculties and governing boards. AF 177. I quote at random from adjacent pages. The book is thickly studded with the like. One is ashamed to copy out the passages. What is one to make of this astonishing anxiety on the part of grown-ups, of professors, of supposedly dedicated scholars? Disguised implicit threats rock the institution, vital threat, most serious apprehensions, lack of understanding. They are not prescient. And all this syndrome, where in many cases admittedly no danger existed, and where altogether at the worst no great danger existed. Is it so hard to clear up misunderstanding by bearding the lion, or to force implicit threats to become explicit and have a bang-up fight? Could these persons really be so concerned about losing their jobs? And if they are really concerned for freedom as a principle and a vital need, is this the tone of such a concern? I fear it is rather the tone of subordinate bureaucrats ridden by self-doubt and with plenty of projected hostility, unable to withstand the least pressure without anxiety. Then I cannot believe in the devotion to inquiry that gives them so little strength of self as this. And I cannot believe in the aggressive intensity of inquiry that gets them into so weak a feeling for the state of things. The job clinging itself is not so much base as a pathetic symptom. How easily they are deflated of their status. What shall we say of an elite of competence that has so little pride and self-confidence? Is this our proud academic freedom? If I felt it was only this, I would tear up my doctorate. The fear of actual investigation, the paranoid suspicion of fancied investigation, the economic panic, need for status, clinging to security. These have been familiar in the American middle classes during the past couple of generations. There is no need to discuss in the context of the academic community the causes that have been operating in the whole community. What is specific, however, is that these are doctors with a proud tradition, sacred symbols, a culture far broader than average, the inspiration of beautiful subject matters and grand authors. In short, a self-transcending responsibility to history past and future that we cannot finally betray without shame and self-betrayal. They must rally, even though the form of the rallying reveals the inner conflict of these books. 4. It is remarkable how, in reading the vigorous and informative history of Professors Hofstadter and Metzger, one can see forming through the decades the lineaments of modern academic man, and an academic notion of inquiry defining itself. The authors call their book a development, and they rightly regard as an achievement the present concept of academic freedom with its Bill of Rights and its highly ramified national system of professional defenses. At the same time, being scrupulous and fairly philosophical and not at all homiletic, they note down the inevitable losses and sloughings off that have occurred along the way. Now, if instead of merely noting these losses, we accumulate them and form them into a picture, what a picture it is, so to speak, an ideal shadow of Western academic man that, we hope, haunts the modern American academic man and sheds on him glory and gives him a bad conscience. Let me collect half a dozen of these contrasts of development and loss. 1. At the time of their greatest independence, says Professor Hofstadter, the universities lived in the interstices of medieval society, taking advantage of its decentralization and the balance of its conflicting powers to further their own corporate interests. They were guilds of masters or students. They appealed to king or council against pope, to pope against king or bishop, and to king and popes alike against truculent town governments. Moreover, they had weapons of their own that put them above the level of mere appellants and gave them independent bargaining power. Among these weapons were the cessation or suspension of lectures, the academic equivalents of the modern strike. A still more powerful device arose, oddly enough, from their very poverty. Unhampered by physical apparatus, great libraries, worldly goods, and substantial college foundations, they could and on occasion did migrate, taking with them their large numbers of students and profitable trade. 7. Dec. 7-8. I suppose this could be taken as the zenith of academic liberty, just as the nadir would be a faculty of science, saddled with its cyclotron, supported 80% by the War Department of a centralized state that dictates the avenues of research, and with A personnel subjected to a clearance arrived at by secret investigation. 2. More than half of this history of universities is occupied with the decline of sectarian control of academic selection, thought, and action, the secularizing of learning. The other side, the loss, is of course that thought and action tend to come to us more lightly. Few of us, though some, spend sleepless nights of doubt about a detail of phrasing in theory leading to an inconsistency in behavior, perhaps publicly unnoticed anyway. Professor Hofstadter charmingly recounts a touching story of the resignation of the first president of Harvard, Henry Dunster, who had found in his heart that no infant could properly be baptized and had to proclaim the same. It seems to me, by the way, that this is an inevitable opinion for a college man who should set great store on learning and inquiry. But Dunster was not dismissed, and he could have kept his job if he had promised to be silent about his unacceptable convictions, for everything in the case indicates that the magistrates and ministers never lost personal confidence in him. Dunster, however, submitted a curious letter of resignation which made no clear reference to religious issues, but dwelled at some length on the recent investigation of the college and the expansion of the powers of the overseers at the expense of the corporation. The General Court gave Dunster the opportunity to take a month to reconsider. Evidently, they still hoped that he could be persuaded to swallow his heresy. But a month later, Dunster closed his presidency with the utmost finality when he interrupted a baptismal service at Cambridge with a startling speech against infant baptism and the corruptions stealing into the church. Dev. 89. What is touching is not so much the president's earnest and dramatic witnessing, exactly in the style of Hawthorne, but the way in which the others respect their brother's right to wrestle with his God and their subsequent solicitude for him. It is unnecessary to mention contemporary contrasts. 3. Again, in discussing the influence on America of the great German universities of the 19th century, the historian, Professor Metzger, beautifully analyzes on the one hand what was carried over, the methodic thoroughness, specific competence, but not the universality of interest, the freedom from utilitarian narrowness, dedication to absolute freedom of truth. And on the other hand, what was sloughed off or suffered a sea change. We come to the heart of the difference when we compare the American and German conceptions of inner and outer freedom. The German idea of convincing one's students, of winning them over to the personal system and philosophical views of the professor, was not condoned by American academic opinion. Rather, as far as classroom actions were concerned, the proper stance for American professors was thought to be one of neutrality on controversial issues and silence on substantive issues that lay outside of their competence. Innumerable utterances affirmed these limitations. Eliot, in the very address that so eloquently declared that the university must be free, made neutrality an aspect of that freedom. It is not the function of the teacher to settle philosophical and political controversies for the pupil, or even to recommend to him any one set of opinions as better than another. The student should be made acquainted with the salient points of each system. Dev. 400. Professor Metzger goes on to argue that this norm of neutrality itself springs from an American bias of thought, its empiricism, resistant to intuition, speculation, fantasy, in the end, a suspicion of deliveries not fairly quickly verifiable. 8. I do not think he sufficiently estimates the disadvantages of the limitation to neutrality as against the German freedom to convince. In the first place, with the American limitation, competence almost automatically becomes specialization, for what quickly verifiable fact is to connect the various parts of study. There is no system of facts, only systems of thought. Again, is Eliot's ideal of neutral presentation something that can possibly exist in a classroom? Have you ever listened to a convinced Whiteheadian trying to present the philosophy of Kant? Then, is the teacher to have no conviction of his own? It is plausible for the school to be neutral and present all sides, but how can the teacher be neutral? But most important, Eliot and Professor Metzger do not see realistically the situation of the student in the face of neutrality and competence. His moral nature must have some culture or other, and if no ideal or moral connections are made in the university, this culture, unless he has had an unusually lucky upbringing, will fall to the first extramural propagandist, or intramural but extracurricular propagandist, or even worse, it will continue in an infantile set of prejudices and unconscious conventionalities, while his intellectual life will be correspondingly arid and without vital strength, and prone to panic before senatorial committees or rabble-rousers. As I have said above, the teacher is responsible either way, whether he freely exerts his influence or withholds it, and I think he does better not to worry about a standard of scientific certainty and impartiality, but relying on the sense of his own integrity to act forthrightly according to probabilities, keeping an open mind and heart. Best of all, no doubt, that he have a wisdom and learning that cuts under controversy and relieves its sharpness, but this is not a stance, but a fact. It is a fact if the professor's urbane detachment, encyclopedic scope, urgent following up, insistence on accuracy, or ability to make the controversy fascinating in itself. There are several admirable styles of teaching, none of them neutral. If these continually provide a new unsettling challenge to the student's wish to have an answer. But it is only a stance if the student feels he has come up against a limit of no opinion. I don't think the majority of teachers are in fact this good. Finally, it seems likely that an important reason for the American standard of professorial neutrality has been the youth and sexual immaturity of our college students as contrasted with the German university students of that time. Our students are more impressionable, but it is hard to see the logic of, on the one hand, dropping the older paternalism or giving it over to administrative deans, and on the other hand, discouraging discipleship. The students are told they are no longer children but young men, but they are forbidden the love affairs, both physical and intellectual, of young men. Yet where could such affairs be safer than at a university? Indeed, the contradiction is sometimes worse. There was a case at a famous Eastern college where in the aftermath of a sexual escapade the dean gave a student's name to the police. A great foreign teacher, who had once served as rector of a European school, exclaimed indignantly, "We were not in loco parentis, and we protected them. You act in loco parentis, and you do not protect them." There spoke 800 years. 4. Another grievous loss for academic man occurred with the abandonment of the liberal arts course of classics for an elective system geared more to adjustment to the changing social scene. Professor Metzger handles this as follows. As the result of deeper social forces at work, the conserving function of the college no longer loomed so large. The unhinging of moral certainties by urban living, the fading out of the evangelical impulse, the depersonalization of human relations in the process of industrial expansion were destroying that integral vision, that firm and assertive credulity required of institutions devoted to conservation. A good part of the pre-Civil War academics' opposition to a more secular university and a more vocationalized curriculum stemmed from the desire to protect very fragile values from the crush of a rough society. He sought the freedom not to acquiesce in the Philistinism of his age. Dev. 317. I think this is wrongly put. It sounds like Alan Tate, who could say, justifiably enough, undo it. At the beginning of academic freedom in our times, Professor MacIver analyzes the climate of opinion unfavorable to academic freedom and finds a major factor in the want of a common culture and a deep-going communication. Given Professor Metzger's analysis here, this is more and more inevitable. The university cannot cure it, but rather tends to worsen it. What is common, integral, and humane is ipso facto out of date and fragile and needing conservation. Meanwhile, the university hastens on to new inquiry. Against this, the great books movement, associated with the names of Hutchins, Adler, McKeown, and Buchanan, has denied that the common culture is out of date, but they have made the contrary mistake, it seems to me, of claiming it is eternal and resides in the great books as classics. All this is topsy-turvy and looking in the wrong place. The true classics are the structures, whether propositions or methods or habits, that are in fact operative in the present juncture, urban, industrial, depersonalized, or whatever. There is always a classical curriculum to be found, because what is classical is simply what is central, concrete, causally operative, underlying. And indeed, in any new situation, the classics never look like classics, nor, in the present state of literature, are they likely to be books. The Socratic dialogue is classic, and in our times it is to be found in the psychoanalytic group session, where very soon one reaches what is integral, humane, and communicative. The experimental method is classic and chastens and unites us, but it must not be taught as a laboratory exercise, nor in a course in logic, but rigorously applied to some real practical behavior. Eurythmics and sports are classic. Mathematizing experience is classic. It is not classic to teach grammar, but it is classic to define the grammar of your speech. The mistake has been to study monuments of classical ages, the Greeks, the medievals, the 17th century, rather than to assume that we are presently creating classics. I propose that this is what Dewey meant by reconstruction, to find and make ourselves classical techniques and a common culture by a philosophical handling of just where we are on our way. This is not what the university has been doing, and now nobody can teach classics, and we do not know what classics we have. 5. Another loss occurred to academic man when he became, and agreed to consider himself as merely an academic man, without some other function and status of his competence in the larger society. The historians relate with too much satisfaction, it seems to me, the development of a specialist profession from a group of clergymen who perhaps temporarily accepted calls as teachers. But teaching on the university level, 9, though it is surely a vocation and requires a special temperament and knack, is not a profession because it does not have a proper subject matter. It is a universal art applied to a proper subject matter. One might as well speak of a professional orator. To the extent that the teacher inquires into the subject matter proper, however, he is not a teacher. And then, why does he hang around the campus so much? One suspicion is, alas, that the ancient maxim is true: if you can't do it, teach it. Teaching is certainly a vocation and a responsibility of every expert. Very few things are more beautiful to see than good teaching. Perhaps nothing is more recreative and enlarging for the expert himself, for he can teach with an integrity generally impossible in practice, and he gets to look at his habit of art with new eyes. Even so, the scene of the same aging grown-ups hanging around while generations of youth pass by has something in it that stinks in the nostrils. As for colleagues, the company of the like-minded is both stimulating and comforting, but to be immured with the like-minded is like living at Princeton. A disadvantage of the professional situation, of course, is that the academic is economically tied. Necessarily, he is fearful of losing his tenure. He cannot, under stress, go off to his proper job where he is indispensable because he produces the goods. In our society, of course, most of those goods do not fetch a price. But perhaps a greater loss is that whole areas and provinces of science and scholarship have become merely intramural. They no longer importantly exist as the property of adult academies and learned societies, which in turn have tended to become merely honorary memberships that give prizes and sponsor social gatherings. Extramural science is bound to industry. Extramural scholarship does not exist at all. Yet it is simply by the accident that there are university libraries and laboratories and stipends that such activities are immured, with correspondingly irrelevant restrictions and duties that must be alleviated by claims to academic freedom. It is hard to know what to advise the scholar, hampered or often hampered by the atmosphere of colleges, in a society that does not much patronize the study of history, linguistics, and literature. Nevertheless, to our ideal picture of the more heroic and free academic man, we would do well to add the lineaments of the humanist and the scientist of the 17th and 18th centuries, who were not professional academics. Dev. 49, 195. 6. Lastly, we must refer to a loss that has come with the coming of the big university. Professor Metzger reads off the indictment from Veblen's The Higher Learning in America. Acutely, he discerned the trend toward bureaucratization was transforming the university's personnel, structure, and behavior. This change was already evidenced in the army of academic functionaries, the deans, directors, registrars, and secretaries, who had come upon the scene to manage the affairs of the university. It was evidenced in the organization of the faculty as a graded hierarchy of ranks within which passage was controlled by a series of official promotions. It was evidenced in the writing of rules that defined the rights and obligations of professors and trustees. It marked, though it did not cause, the end of an academic era in which the college had been a community and the faculty a body of peers. Dev. 453. Dealing with this and the rest of Veblen's Jeremiad, Metzger seeks to prove, successfully enough, that big business as such was not the guilty agent, that the changes were socially pervasive and inevitable. But otherwise, I am baffled by the equanimity of his acquiescence. I should have thought that the faculty is the university, and if this university ceases to exist, what is there to write about as a continuing historical entity? We have come full circle from our first historical quotation about the Guild of Scholars choosing the interstices of a plural society and willing to preserve itself by migrating bag and baggage. Now we have, apparently, merely one wheel in a machine that needs, to be sure, its own special oil and rules for successful operation. But we can hardly expect to hear from it any unique delivery of the creator spirit. This is not very interesting. If the brothers do not confront one another face to face and communally decide, nothing follows from their being brothers. Academic man becomes the same as any other American man. This is just what one surmised from the passages of anxiety in Mac Ivor's book, professors behaving like all the other sheep. It is uncharitable to level at them any special charges or to subject them to any special scrutiny. But then what is all the talk about a peculiar dedication? But I am sanguine enough to believe that the case is not so desperate as this. The case is, it seems to me, and it is expressed in the tone and matter of both these stimulating books, that there is a double academic man. Looming ever in the background is this ghostly presence or absence that we have been figuring forth by the accumulation of lost causes that can never be lost. I have tried to cull traits that show him in his extramural and intramural relations, in his personal responsibility and community, in his curriculum and livelihood. He is part of a band, intensely self-conscious and self-important, as Powys said, and that carries colors and a coat of arms, not bashfully. He feels himself the carrier of Western culture and the champion of new invention. He has a deserved reputation as a stickler for antique tradition with excessive scrupulosity, and for stirring up entirely gratuitous innovations just to make trouble. He is prone to terrible knockdown conflicts with his colleagues on the basis of mutual respect, and to erotic devotions, both lenitive and dangerous, toward his students. He goes abroad on his career in the world and sits on the faculty as an independent man of the world. This ghost, I say, is continually trying to break into reality and take over, but he is restrained, in many ways, let me hasten to add, fortunately restrained, by the circumstances of social history, very fully explained by our authors. Restrained and non-existent, but he exerts an eerie fascination on the living body, rouses in him dreams, makes him touchy and irritable, and suddenly ashamed and rebellious. And sometimes he gets hold of the speech and utters things like Professor MacIver's somewhat mesmerized sermons. In the foreground and with us is the other academic man, frightened by a noisy politician. Caught in a bureaucracy, ridden by authority from above and bullying others from below, he is afraid of a black mark against him, because if he loses his job here, he won't have good references elsewhere. There is only one academic world, and it is for him the only world. Weighed down by vast mortmain properties, corporately held, and that make the living faculty a trivial force, and dependent for current expenses on alien interests that pay the piper and call the tune. Unerotic and at least publicly antisexual, naturally he is subject to anxiety. He uses lofty ethical terms to shame others, but gets remarkably little strength and animation from the reality pretended. He engages in plenty of intramural bickering and jockeying for position, but never in a bang-up fight. He does a good deal of obsessional counting and methodical busywork that is not very different from telling beads. He is not distinguishable and circumspectly avoids becoming so by overt action. He and his fellows huddle together not as a totemic band, but because it is cold. This is the academic man that speaks in Professor MacIver's reportage. Appendix E. Review of On the Road 10. In 300 pages, these fellows cross America 8 times, usually camping on friends or relatives, and they have kicks. The narrator tends to become saddened by it all, but gives little evidence of understanding why. The fellows seem to be in their middle or late 20s, not long after my wife and I split up. Surprisingly, for the kicks are the same as we used to have less solemnly in our teens, between terms. Mostly they are from the middle class. Many other young men in their 20s and 30s call this book crazy and the greatest, as if it were their history. They were there, so let's look into it. To an uncritical reading, On the Road seems worse written than it is. There are hundreds of incidents, but throughout most of the book, nothing is told, nothing is presented, everything is just written about. Worse, the narrator seems to try to pep it up by sentences like, "That night all hell broke loose," when the incident is some drinking sailors refusing to obey an order. "This was the greatest ride I ever had," but nothing occurs beyond a fellow getting his pants wet trying to urinate from a moving truck. "This was exciting, this was the greatest," but it's not exciting. Soon, when the narrator or some other character says the greatest, we expect that he means pretty fair. But alas, he does not mean even this, but simply that there was some little object of experience, of whatever value, instead of the blank of experience in which these poor kids generally live. For when you ask yourself what is expressed by this prose, by this buoyant writing about racing across the continent, you find that it is the woeful emptiness of running away from even loneliness and vague discontent. The words exciting, crazy, the greatest, do not refer to any object or feeling, but are a means by which the members of the Beat generation convince one another that they have been there at all. I dig it doesn't mean I understand it, but I perceive that something exists out there. On me as a reader, the effect is dismay. I know some of these boys, I say boys. Jack Kerouac is 35. Last summer I listened to Kerouac's friend Allen Ginsberg read a passage from his Howl. It was a list of imprecations that he began pianissimo and ended with a thunderous fortissimo. The fellows were excited, it was the greatest. But I sadly asked Allen just where in either the ideas, the imagery, or the rhythm was the probability for the crescendo, what made it a sequence at all, and a sequence to be read just like that. The poet was crestfallen and furious. This thought had never occurred to him. And yet, during those few minutes, They had shared the simple-minded excitement of his speaking in a low voice and gradually increasing to a roar. It was not much of a poetic experience, but it was something. It was better than feeling nothing at all that night. What Kerouac does well, not just writes about, is his description of the jazz musician who has hit on it, and everybody goes wild shouting, "Go, man, go," but they cannot say what it is. These boys are touchingly inarticulate because they don't know anything, but they talk so much and so loud because they feel insulted by the existence of the grown-ups who know a little bit. You can't howl a gripe, Alan. You can howl in pain or in rage, but what you are doing is griping. Perhaps the pain is too sore to utter a sound at all, and certainly their justifiable rage is far too dangerous for them to feel at all. The entire action of On the Road is the avoidance of interpersonal conflict. One is stunned at how conventional and law-fearing these lonely middle-class fellows are. They dutifully get legal marriages and divorces. The hint of a gangbang makes them impotent. They never masturbate or perform homosexual acts. They do not dodge the draft. They are hygienic about drugs and diet. They do not resent being underpaid, nor speak up at all. To disobey a cop is all hell. Their idea of crime is the petty shoplifting of 10-year-olds stealing cigarettes or of teenagers joy riding in other people's cars. But how could it be otherwise? It is necessary to have some contact with institutions and people in order to rebel against them. It is necessary to want something in order to be frustrated and angry. They have the theory that to be affectless, not to care, is the ultimate rebellion, but this is a fantasy, for right under the surface, obvious to a trained eye, is burning shame, hurt feelings, fear of impotence, speechless and powerless tantrum, cowering before papa, being rebuffed by mama. And it is these anxieties that dictate their behavior in every crisis. Their behavior is a conformity plus royaliste que le roi. One kid, aged 21, visited my home the other night, carrying his copy of On the Road. The salient feature was his expressionless mask face, with the squared jaw of unconscious, suspicious watchfulness, the eyes in a fixed stare of unfelt hostility, plus occasional grinding of his back teeth at a vague projected threat. Even the hostility was hard to make overt, but his lips cracked in a small childish smile when he was paid attention to. But nothing can be interesting from coast to coast, boy, if you do not respond to it with some interest. Instead, all you can possibly get is to activate your rigid body in various towns, what you call kicks. He explained that one had to avoid committing oneself to any activity, lest one make a wrong choice. It is useful to place this inexpressive face and his unoffending kicks in our recent literary genealogy. Great-granddaddy, I guess, is the stoical hero of Hemingway. Hemingway's young fellow understands that the grown-up world is corrupt and shattering, but he is not beat, for he can prove that he is himself a man by being taciturn, growing hair on his chest, and shooting elephants. He has values and therefore can live through a few books. His heir is Celine's anti-hero, a much shrewder fellow. He sees that to have those values is already to be duped by the corrupt adults, so he adopts the much more powerful role of universal griper and crybaby to make everybody feel guilty and disgusted. The bother with his long gripe is that it is monotonous. There is a lot of opportunity for writing, but not even a single book. The next hero, and I think the immediate predecessor of being On the Road, gives up the pretense of being grown up altogether. A good case is Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. He is the boy in the very act of being mortally wounded by the grown-up's corruption. This terrible moment is one book, but you can't cry forever, so you set your face in a mask and go on the road. The adolescent decides that he himself is the guilty one. This is less painful than the memory of being hurt, so he'd better get going. The trouble is that there is no longer any drama in this. The drama occurred before my wife and I split up, before I lost my father. Sociologically, the following propositions seem to me to be relevant. 1. In our economy of abundance, there are also surplus people, and the fellows on the road are among them. There is in fact no man's work for them to do. 2. We are inheriting our failure, as an advanced industrial country, to have made reasonable social arrangements in the last century. Now, when there is no longer a motive to work hard and accumulate capital, we have not developed an alternative style of life. 3. The style that we do have, Madison Avenue, is too phony for a young person to grow up into. 4. Alternatively, there is an attraction to the vitality, by comparison, of the disfranchised Negroes and now the Puerto Ricans. These provide a language and music, but this culture is primitive and it corrupts itself to Madison Avenue as soon as it can. 5. In family life, there has been a similar misrevolution and confusion, so that many young people have grown up in cold, hypocritical, or broken homes. Lacking a primary environment for the expression and training of their feelings, they are both affectless and naive in the secondary environment. 6. The spontaneous, wild invention that we may expect from every young generation has been seriously blighted by the anxieties of the war and the Cold War. 7. The style of life resulting from all this is an obsessional conformity, busyness without any urge toward the goals of activity, whether ideal goals or wealth and power. There is not much difference between the fellows on the road and the organization men. They frequently exchange places. I ate another apple pie and ice cream. That's practically all I ate all the way across the country. I knew it was nutritious, and it was delicious, of course. Page 15. On other occasions, they eat franks and beans. More rarely hamburgers, malted milks, of course. That is, the drink-down quick-sugar foods of spoiled children and the pre-cut meat for lazy chewing beloved of ages 6 to 10. Nothing is bitten or bitten off, very little is chewed. There is a lot of sugar for animal energy, but not much solid food to grow on. I suppose that this is the most significant observation one can make about On the Road. For nearly 2/3 of this book one is struck, I have said, by the lack of writing. The book is nothing but a conversation between the buddies. Do you remember when? And do you remember how we? That was the greatest. Here is confirmation that they, like Kilroy, were there, but not much distilled experience for the reader. But then, page 173, there is a page of writing, not very good and not original. It is from the vein of Rhapsody of Saline and Henry Miller, nevertheless, writing. The situation is that the narrator finally finds himself betrayed, abandoned, penniless, and hungry in a strange city. The theme of the rhapsody is medium psychoses. I realized that I had died and been reborn numberless times, but just didn't remember. And this theme is a happy invention, for it momentarily raises the road to a plane of metaphysical fantasy. And this is how the passage climaxes. In the window, I smelled all the food of San Francisco. Let me smell the drawn butter and lobster claws. There were places where they specialized in thick red roast beef, au jus, or roast chicken basted in wine. There were places where hamburg sizzled on grills and the coffee was only a nickel. And oh, that pan-fried chow mein. Here, at least in Wish, is a piece of reality that is not just kicks and the greatest. He wants to eat this food. Cylone was right when he said that we must learn again the words for bread and wine. Appendix F. The Crime of Our Century, 11. Compulsion by Mayor Levin, Simon and Schuster, 1956, 495 pp. $500. Nothing But the Night by James Yaffe, Boston, Little Brown Co., 336 pp. $3.95. Here are two recent books about the Leopold Loeb case, which Mayor Levin calls the crime of our century. It occurred when Levin was in college, 1924. James Yaffe is younger and takes the whole matter less seriously. Now the case is always considered the typical crime of the 20s, and I should like to set against these books for comparison a book of the 20s, Dreiser's An American Tragedy, 1925, which retells a typical murder of the time of Dreiser's own youth, the case of Chester Gillette, 1906. By this comparison, I hope to say something about the 20s and the 50s, 2 decades of expansion. I am not here making a literary evaluation, yet I must begin from a literary distinction. Of the two recent books, Yaffe's is quite worthless, by bowdlerizing, up-to-dating, stereotyping, and juvenilizing the events and persons of the case. He contrives to lose both artistic probability and any other interest. But Compulsion is not a bad book. By its earnest selection of the journalistic, medical, and legal material, often given verbatim, it presents an interesting and believable report. And Levin makes something touching and significant of the narrator's involvement in the action. Dreiser's book, however, is of a different genre It is a work of art, not to my taste, a wonderful work, but a work of art in that it makes itself a world, and this world is more important than the case. It is the real case. The questions that I would ask are these. What would a book about the crime of our century be like if it were worked as Dreiser worked? Would such a work get itself written and received? What, contrariwise, are Levin and Yaffe doing? And what does this tell us about the 50s and the 20s? What strikes one immediately and persistently is how Dreiser is in his story, in a way that our writers are not. He works as though all the motives and behaviors were immediately plausible, unquestionable by either the author or the audience, and therefore needing no explanation, only presentation. He may or may not have a theory of causation. We know that he had several, but he does not need one, and he does not offer one. Simply he shows us how first undeniably Clyde Griffiths did and suffered so and so, and then he did and suffered so and so. Instead of causation and the imputation of responsibility or compulsion, we get a solid and stolid probability that adds up to a real world. That's just how it was, like life, only more so. Dreiser carries this through admirably. The only episode that seems to me sketchy and a little fumbled is the temptation to the murder plan, but the author recovers. Again, as a doctrinaire naturalist, Dreiser eschews every literary attitude except this narrowly selective, lifelike presentation. There is no perspective, no irony, no wonder, no humor, no wisdom, compassion, admiration or contempt, no symbol, no formal surprise, certainly no sympathy, but love, the love of undeviating attentiveness. In all these ways Dreiser is not involved in the crime, but we shall see that just in these ways Levin and Yaffe are, each in his own fashion, involved. They cannot present the case as a naturalistic probability. Levin wisely makes little effort to do so and relies on the documents to move his story. That's how it was, because that's how it was reported in the press. When Yaffe tries it, his story moves not at all. When Dreiser succeeds in his artwork of this kind, there follow two cultural consequences of the highest importance. In the first place, he triumphantly vindicates the art act itself, for it is art and art alone that does human justice to Clyde Griffiths and perhaps to his original Chester Gillette, but that no longer makes any difference. Here Dreiser is perfectly aware of what he is doing. He devotes his entire denouement to the varying attempts to understand and be fair to the young murderer. The trial, the appeal, the compassionate minister, the wise governor, the loving and sacrificing mother, and finally the confused boy himself, trying honestly to assay himself. No one truly understands what occurred, but the author can say, nay, read here, this is what occurred. Indeed, my bother with this good book is that Dreiser does not bring this poignant problem to the forefront soon enough. He does not show us until too far along the confused youth, longing to be understood and told what he is. Dreiser shows us always his vacillation and cowardice, but not enough his confused integrity. He sticks so close to what is like that particular life that he misses one transcendent tragedy of every life. But even more relevant to our present theme, when Dreiser succeeds in making a probable crime by accepting every usual presupposition, the social effect is revolutionary. If people do not like the outcome, they cannot simply reject it. They must reject the whole sequence en bloc. And since they have been patiently led along step by step, accepting every step as sensible, plausible, and like their lives, they must they not, be shaken in their whole way of experiencing as a viable way of life. See, says the author, here is how you make sense, and it is not viable. Something is wrong. At this level, simply to entertain an alternative morality to the one that doomed Clyde is to disavow the morality you grew up in. Historically, Dreiser's works were part of the revolutionary change in the sexual mores. The events of an American tragedy would no longer be probable if retold today. This particular plot would occur today in a soap opera. The authors of our books on Leopold and Loeb are not in those events, which are alien to them. There is no shared assumption of author and audience that this is, step by step, inevitable behavior leading up to what is quite unacceptable, but must be accepted nevertheless, or all our sense, rejected en bloc. Yaffe's book is merely manufactured on a causal theory, that such and such parental attitudes lead to such and such juvenile delinquency. The premises are stereotypes, and the aesthetic effect is the frigid one of having established a possibility, for the sake of argument or to get a book written, that such and such might occur. But there is never any probability or internal motion. Levin, much more masterfully, makes the chief thing his own need to find out the cause, a fine theme, not unlike Proust's. But then there is too much about Leopold and Loeb, and not enough about Mayer Levin. The aesthetic effect of the major bulk, the crime, is the harsh one of unpleasant newspaper reports. Both authors make the philosophical error of trying to present a living process by explaining it rather than by reliving it with us. Their causes are ex post facto. At every moment the protagonists might do otherwise, but don't happen to. Afterward, we can trace the trajectory they did follow, as if to say, there must have been a compulsion. We are certainly none the wiser about ourselves, or any urgent present matter. Then there arises the question, what on earth makes two writers devote so much effort to a narrative they cannot get on with, and one of them to call it by such a title as the crime of our century? Why do they treat with it at all? This is a crucial question. They are obviously fascinated. With what? It is fortunate that we have two books, for unlike as they are in most respects, they prove to have a couple of surprising attitudes in common, and these give us the clue to the relevance of these books at this time in the 50s. As alien as they are to the case, our authors feel even more alien to the social milieu in which the case occurs. In Yaffe, who up-to-dates the story, the disaffection is blatant from the beginning. He is dealing with what would be normally a gloomy subject, yet with almost every character except the protagonists, his manner is usually satirical and often sarcastic. One father is a frigid ass, the other is a weak fool, one mother is sickly and timid, the other is a domineering club woman and a fool, the principal is a pompous fool, the lawyer is a vain conniver, the psychiatrists don't care, the judge is a sentimental fool. And as his story reaches its climax, Yaffe hits on the pattern he is after, that nobody is concerned with the one important thing, the case, but this one is interested in his golf score, that one in his new article, another in his business prestige, etc. To drive it home, the author runs through the routine a second time. Levin's disaffection is more touching. It is a slow growth to awareness of how pointless his own career as a man has been. Let me quote from his ending. As it happened, I never again reached the intense involvement and achievement, if achievement it may be called, of my first assignment. When something big comes to us early in our careers, we have an expectation of exceeding and exceeding ourselves. Yet for some this never happens, just as, for some, no later love has the quality of first love. I married, divorced, and during the war I was a correspondent with the Third Army. It was in the last weeks that the case came finally home to me. Back in America, he meets his first love. Looking at her, I was thinking, it could have been, it could all have been. And I tended my job and married again, and we live in Norwalk. But the social disaffection of both authors is evident also in their surprising attitude toward the two protagonists. They sympathize with and admire the dark, funny-looking Jewish intellectual misfit. Of course, in Yaffe nobody is Jewish. The one who wears the glasses and loses the glasses. The brooding one who has the fantasies of being a serviceable slave. They yearn to extenuate for him according to their own standards of decency, and Yaffe even contrives his metaphysical salvation. But toward the other, the fair good-looking youth, skilled in sports, dancing, and dramatics, sought after by the girls and boys, both authors are cold and even hostile. He is somehow to blame. What does this mean? Our authors look at themselves and at the world and its desirable roles, and they find nothing to admire and love, at most something to envy and be vindictive about, but certainly nothing that adds up to what you could be intensely involved in or to achieve anything there. Yaffe the younger takes this pretty much for granted. Levin has learned it as he pursued his career and found that he, or it makes no difference, didn't come across. But there were those two rich and bright boys back in the 20s who had everything, and they were wise to it already. They acted it out. It is fascinating, because one of them seduced the other into doing something spectacularly pointless. For the excitement, they committed the crime of our century. As is often the case, the opening page of compulsion, before the author has a chance to develop his habitual defenses, tells more about the case and the real situation than all the rest. A professor is giving a brilliant cram lecture for the morrow's entrance examination to law school. Judd, who killed the boy the day before, takes no notes, yet he is paying attention because he seizes the first occasion to interrupt and bother the teacher and the class with his theory of the Superman, but he feels they don't understand his argument. Levin here wants to portray the preoccupied youth, doodling a hawk, and unable to keep away from the area of the crime, and this is very well. But the salient psychological features of the scene are not these unconscious ones, but much simpler and revealing ones. 1. What would seem to be objectively important, the cram lecture and the examination, is unimportant not only to Judd, but also to the other students and to the teacher, for they rush at once into the time-wasting argument. 2. The aim of the young man is chiefly to claim attention, as if starved for attention, and to have something vital to him drawn forth and treated seriously, though not necessarily approved, even perhaps more to be refuted. 3. But since what he offers has no immediate practical content, there is no way to get himself understood. He wants to share his fantasy, which is his only creative act, but it is only a fantasy. We can be sure that, uninterested in the objective business of society, the examination, and unable to make contact with the other persons, he will pour his energy into lush fantasies indeed. Of course, I am not here speaking of Leopold and Leib, but of how they exist as fantasies of Mayor Levin. Now let me revert to the first question above. If our author were going to artifice a real world of the case, as Dreiser did in An American Tragedy, it is in these scenes of social behavior and how the protagonists are in them and how they are not in them that half the substance of the work would be. This is especially true for the outgoing, the socially successful youth, Artie. The author tells us, for instance, that Artie is a fine tennis player. In Yaff's book, the counterpart is manager of the baseball team. How is he in these sports? We get not a word, but Levin, in one brief passage, lets us know that Artie is impotent. Then we can envisage him on the field, or dancing hot jazz, throwing himself wildly into it for the relieving excitement of the muscular activity, excelling with the need to prove potency and with the flash of triumph and contempt in doing so, but never with the total release of orgasm, having always something unfinished and the need more fiercely next time to repeat, and with this, the inability to get any of the quiet rewards of activity and success. He can do it and he proves it, but then it doesn't mean anything and he turns on his heel, or more deeply, he turns on his heel in full flight from the anxiety of losing control and bursting into tears. Levin is concerned with explaining, and he is compassionate, but if he envisaged the real scenes and simply constructed them, there would be no need for explanation, any more than Dreiser explains anything, and the work itself would repair something, make it whole again, and this is the act of compassion. Now the other half of such a reconstruction of the real case would, I think, deal with the proliferating fantasies, especially of the inward-turning youth. It happens that in our generation, by no accident, writers have learned to reconstruct such masturbation fantasies as a literary form. Jennett is the most masterly. Henry Miller is more pedestrian. The essence of such reconstruction is that the physical and social reality, the other's reality, enters the presented world with apparent caprice, or is there only on the fringes. Its meaning and value is the use it plays in beginning, maintaining, and heightening the fantasy. Certainly this is not far from the Leopold Loeb case, as told in the books we are considering, but our authors do not stay with the fantasist's world and therefrom lead us to the crime step by step, as it really was. Rather, they persist in keeping the social valuation as their structural framework, and then the overt acts of fantasy occur as alien and require a causal explanation. And yet these same authors, as I have said, do not take that social reality seriously at all. Then what on earth are they doing? They are fascinated and they are avoiding. In order to get something more nearly resembling what Dreiser did, we could structure this material as follows. On the one hand, the scenes of the unsatisfactoriness of our social reality, made obvious and probable for us, the final pointlessness of the esteemed roles and careers, of the games and dates, the coldness of the families and fraternities, and the gnawing need to exceed. On the other hand, the rich reality of the fantasy world into which something looms from outside, so that there begins to occur overt behavior continuous with the fantasy. It is in this matrix that the events occur that are reported in the newspapers as crime by those who have not gone step by step this whole road. The youths kill a random boy for no reason, that is, for a trivial reason that would fit a trivial deed. But of course to them, the deed is neither enormous nor trivial, but of the order of their other acts, and their reason is not trivial, but to run the risk of being caught, exposed, punished. It is hard to know what Levin means by compulsion. He seems to be saying that the death wish is compelling, but I think the usual psychological wisdom is that the thrilling excitement, the compulsion, is in the confrontation with the others. This is what the effectless repeat. Yaffe and Levin seem to be peculiarly moved by the acts. They do not seem to understand how any principle of disaffection or estrangement, continuously operating, will take a person far afield, and not only negative principles, but such positive faculties as healthy lust or common sense in a crazy world will eventually lead a man to enormities of eccentricity, and the honest artistic need to touch a smug and debauched audience eventuates in dada. But these books keep the enormity of the act in the foreground. The crime is isolated. We continually feel their tug toward the crime as unfinished business for themselves. Several times Levin says as much. They cannot make the agents real and the act inevitable. They are too involved. They must explain it away. To sum up our comparison, in these books, it is the crime we are to disavow and not the world of our assumptions. Yet that world is not looked at squarely either, but avoided. But in an American tragedy, it was not the murder, but the whole way of social life in which that murder was an incident that was recreated. And since our own experience of life allowed us to regard the sequence of events as probable, we had radically to disavow it, that is, to entertain alternatives. Yet the book we have proposed in theory, portraying as plausible and probable so radical a disaffection from the accepted institutions and behaviors, and developing with sympathy the fantasies of perversity, such a book could not get itself accepted. People do not dare to disavow so frankly our conventionally desirable world, and therefore they would not admit the real scenes to be plausible, nor can they accept the fantasies of desire as what someone indeed might desire. It would all seem far-fetched and repugnant, rather than only too real and inadmissible en bloc. Yet the books that put the crime in the foreground, these exert a fascination. Let me now generalize and compare the 20s and 50s as two periods of expansion. Both are marked by a booming productivity, much money to spend, a rising standard of living, and also by cultural adjustments to great technical innovations that offer exciting prospects. Radio then and television now, flying the ocean and the geophysical year, relativity physics and psychoanalysis then, and nucleonics and psychotherapy now. In both decades, a vast increase in international travel and cultural exchange. Such things both support and give content to the expansion. At the same time, the 20s and the 50s are marked by a profound disillusionment and disgust at the way our civilization has recently disgraced itself. No doubt the First World War was a more severe shock to moral preconceptions. We were inured by their experience of barbarism, yet we managed to turn up with crematoria and atom bombs. But these experiences, too, foster expansion in those who survive and in whom the shell shock thaws out, for people are purged, especially if there has been frank vomiting, and then more daring and radical notions can express themselves with a good conscience, since nothing an individual can think of would be so wicked as what everybody thought of collectively. But there is also a dark contrast between the decades. The 20s were a time in which people really believed that there would never be another war. Great nations scuttled their warships according to a formula and signed the Kellogg-Briand Agreement. This element of security is of course capital to an expanding mood, for it is the absence of an external counterpressure. If we consider the artistic creations of the 20s, they were indeed such as one would expect and hope for in a time of expansion and disgust. There was a flowering of advance-guard work, experimental, offensive, outrageous, bringing to a large public the esoteric efforts of several decades. And the standard style, as by that time an American tragedy was in standard style, moved with serene self-confidence, immune from the need to explain, as if all the necessary radical positions had been securely conquered. In art, as in politics, we had all the three elements necessary for the emergence of novelty: expanding energy, a rejection of the past, and security enough to tolerate confusion and anxiety. Artistic creation today gives rather an impression of being balked, potential but unable to get along. There is a counterpressure that both opposes expansion and discourages it inwardly. Not only is there no peace, but no forthright effort for it. The international community and even science are not free exchanges, and the increased standard of living no longer pays off in pride and joy, for people are avoiding some risk. There is not enough security, therefore not enough ability to tolerate anxiety, and therefore not enough risk of something startlingly new. At the same time, of course, there is too much disgust with the old, and too much new energy to burn to allow for great conventional products. Instead, there is a balked and teasing flirtation with something different, without daring to affirm it. It is in this ambience, I think, that books like Compulsion and Nothing But the Night get themselves conceived in fascination, executed defensively, and widely accepted by an audience that will not thereby change. They are widely accepted because everybody is in the same boat. Everybody knows better, but few dare to believe it and witness it. Finally, let me return to the case itself. The 20s had flaming youth. The 50s have juvenile delinquents. Leopold and Loeb were not flaming youth. They were juvenile delinquents, a generation ahead of their time, and therefore they seem now to have committed the crime of our century. Flaming youth is rebellious youth, astoundingly careless of the wisdom it rejects, claiming to be grown up and untrammeled even while admitting it might be making mistakes to which it claims a right. But its aims are positive enough: sex, speed, and liquor to relax inhibition, ideal political doctrines, and frank answers in words of one syllable for thorny moral dilemmas. These are kids, they recur, looking for an honest adult to refute them. Mayor Levin's protagonists show some of this zeal, but I suspect that it is Levin who is looking for the honest adult. Our juvenile delinquents are not rebellious, but resigned, and they are trapped and desperate. Since these young people do not know where to try to exercise their energies, they do mischief. The speed and liquor, and the PAL and the fan clubs are not the prelude to a quieter good time, but to more desperate expedients toward excitement. Their philosophy would be existence and elacti graduite, except that to philosophize affirms an essence, truth, and it is not an acti graduite, but the property of a rational animal. Dreiser's Clyde Griffiths is a dumb precursor of the rebel. He feels he is deprived, only he does not know how, and he is lovingly portrayed in a decade when they thought they knew what was wrong, and importantly did know, and were engaged in changing it. But our present protagonists have everything and it's no good. There is no point in their rebelling against their fathers, for they don't have it either, and nobody demonstrates anything new for them in the bestsellers. They are rebels without a cause. I am reminded of the commencement exercises some years ago at one of the superior academic high schools in New York, Music and Art. Senator Javits, then state's attorney, addressed the class and urged them to help combat juvenile delinquency by interesting the tough kids of their neighborhoods in their own cultural pursuits. Abstractly, this was not a foolish proposal, even meaty for a commencement address. But the teenagers to whom I listened thought it was ridiculous, that the delinquents were much in the right, and they were stronger and would influence the good boys rather than the other way around. Also, with a certain purity, that music and art should not be degraded to do police work, for they impugn the state's attorney's motives. 1 from Dissent, Autumn, 1959. 2 from Liberation, January, 1959. 3 from I.E., The Cambridge Review No. 5. 4 throughout, AF refers to academic freedom in our times by Robert M. McIver, N.Y., 1955. Columbia University Press, 304 pp. Dev refers to the development of academic freedom in the United States by Richard Hofstadter and Walter P. Metzger, N.Y., 1955, Columbia University Press, 506 pp. 5. Major and surprising defect in these books is their omission of any discussion of the small radical colleges like Antioch, Black Mountain, Goddard, etc., founded on more liberal principles than the authors, and therefore with both a more intransigent standard of freedom and more embarrassment in being consistent. I should have thought their careers would be valuably relevant for comparison and contrast. 6. But consider the dilemma. Such massive research and experiment must be financed, if not administered, by foundations, and those chosen by or for foundations tend to be at least sound, if not safe. 7. So Black Mountain College was founded by a migration in the early 1930s, and the migrant faculty was thenceforth the owner of the college, without a governing board of trustees. 8. This neutrality certainly has also a simpler and more traditional spring, the detachment of the wise and experienced, and the tradition of the academy as the home of the wise and experienced, with the motto nil admirari. Such an attitude is, of course, not neutral at all, but the provision of a background of security predifferent to controversial opinions, and relying on which youth can risk having definite opinions. 9. Teaching at the primary level is different, for there the emphasis is on teaching the pupil, not the subject matter, and there is then a profession of pedagogy analogous to medicine, and of which the remedial branch is psychotherapy. 10. From Midstream, Winter, 1958. 11. From Midstream, Summer, 1957. On Paul Goodman's, I am writing this in Paris, in a room about 4 by 10, sitting on a wicker chair at a typing table in front of a window which looks onto a garden. At my back is a cot and a night table. On the floor and under the table are manuscripts, notebooks, and 2 or 3 paperback books. That I have been living and working for more than a year in such small bare quarters, though not at the beginning planned or thought out, undoubtedly answers to some need to strip down while finding a new space inside my head. Here where I have no books, where I spend too many hours writing to have time to talk to anyone, I am trying to make a new start with as little capital as possible to fall back on. In this Paris in which I live now, which has as little to do with the Paris of today as the Paris of today has to do with the Great Paris, capital of the 19th century and seedbed of art and ideas, until the late 1960s, America is the closest of all the faraway places. Even during periods when I don't go out at all, and in the last months there have been many blessed days and nights when I have no desire to leave the typewriter except to sleep. Each morning someone brings me the Paris Herald Tribune with its monstrous collage of news of America, encapsulated, distorted, stranger than ever from this distance. The B-52's raining mega-echodath on Vietnam, the repulsive martyrdom of Thomas Eagleton, the paranoia of Bobby Fischer, the irresistible ascension of Woody Allen, excerpts from the diary of Arthur Bremer, and last week, the death of Paul Goodman. I find that I can't write just his first name. Of course, we called each other Paul and Susan whenever we met, but both in my head and in conversation with other people, he was never Paul or ever Goodman, but always Paul Goodman, the whole name, with all the ambiguity of feeling and familiarity which that usage implies. The grief I feel at Paul Goodman's death is sharper because we were not friends, though we coinhabited several of the same worlds. We first met 20 years ago. I was 19, a graduate student at Harvard, dreaming of living in New York, and on a weekend trip to the city someone I knew at the time who was a friend of his brought me to the loft on 23rd Street, where Paul Goodman and his wife were celebrating his 40th birthday. He was drunk. He boasted raucously to everyone about his sexual exploits. He talked to me just long enough to be mildly rude. The second time we met was 4 years later at a party on Riverside Drive, where he seemed more subdued, but just as cold and self-absorbed. In 1959, I moved to New York, and from then on through the late 1960s, we met often, though always in public, at parties given by mutual friends, at panel discussions and Vietnam teach-ins, on marches, in demonstrations. I usually made a shy effort to talk to him each time we met, hoping to be able to tell him, directly or indirectly, how much his books mattered to me and how much I had learned from him. Each time he rebuffed me, and I retreated. I was told by mutual friends that he didn't really like women as people, though he made an exception for a few particular women, of course. I resisted that hypothesis as long as I could. It seemed to me cheap, then finally gave in. After all, I had sensed just that in his writings. For instance, The Major Defect of Growing Up Absurd, which purports to treat the problems of American youth, is that it talks about youth as if it consists only of adolescent boys and young men. My attitude when we met ceased being open. Last year, another mutual friend, Ivan Illich, invited me to Cuernavaca at the same time that Paul Goodman was there giving a seminar, and I told Ivan that I preferred to come after Paul Goodman had left. Ivan knew, through many conversations, how much I admired Paul Goodman's work. But the intense pleasure I felt each time at the thought that he was alive and well and writing in the United States of America made an ordeal out of every situation in which I actually found myself in the same room with him and sensed my inability to make the slightest contact with him. In that quite technical sense, then, not only were Paul Goodman and I not friends, but I disliked him, the reason being, as I often explained plaintively during his lifetime, that I felt he didn't like me. How pathetic and merely formal that dislike was I always knew. It is not Paul Goodman's death that has suddenly brought this home to me. He had been a hero of mine for so long that I was not in the least surprised when he became famous, and always a little surprised that people seemed to take him for granted. The first book of his I ever read, I was 16, was a collection of stories called The Breakup of Our Camp, published by New Directions. Within a year, I had read everything he'd written, and from then on started keeping up. There is no living American writer for whom I have felt the same simple curiosity to read as quickly as possible anything he wrote, on any subject. That I mostly agreed with what he thought was not the main reason. There are other writers I agree with to whom I am not so loyal. It was that voice of his that seduced me, that direct, cranky, egotistical, generous American voice. Many writers in English insist on saturating their writing with an idiosyncratic voice. If Norman Mailer is the most brilliant writer of his generation, it is surely by reason of the authority and eccentricity of his voice. And yet, I for one have always found that voice too baroque, somehow fabricated. I admire Mailer as a writer, but I don't really believe in his voice. Paul Goodman's voice is the real thing. There has not been such a convincing, genuine, singular voice in our language since D.H. Lawrence. Paul Goodman's voice touched everything he wrote about with intensity, interest, and his own terribly appealing sureness and awkwardness. What he wrote was a nervy mixture of syntactical stiffness and verbal felicity. He was capable of writing sentences of a wonderful purity of style and vivacity of language, and also capable of writing so sloppily and clumsily that one imagined he must be doing it on purpose. But it never mattered. It was his voice, that is to say, his intelligence and the poetry of his intelligence incarnated, which kept me a loyal and passionate addict. Though he was not often graceful as a writer, his writing and his mind were touched with grace. There is a terrible, mean American resentment towards someone who tries to do a lot of things. The fact that Paul Goodman wrote poetry and plays and novels as well as social criticism, that he wrote books on intellectual specialties guarded by academic and professional dragons, such as city planning, education, literary criticism, psychiatry, was held against him. His being an academic freeloader and an outlaw psychiatrist, while also being so smart about universities and human nature, outraged many people. That ingratitude is and always was astonishing to me. I know that Paul Goodman often complained of it. Perhaps the most poignant expression was in the journal he kept between 1955 and 1960, published as 5 years, in which he laments the fact that he is not famous, not recognized, and rewarded for what he is. That journal was written at the end of his long obscurity, for with the publication of Growing Up Absurd in 1960, he did become famous, and from then on his books had a wide circulation, and one imagines were even widely read, if the extent to which Paul Goodman's ideas were repeated, without his being given any credit, is any proof of being widely read. From 1960 on, he started making money through being taken more seriously, and he was listened to by the young. All that seems to have pleased him, though he still complained that he was not famous enough, not read enough, not appreciated enough. Far from being an egomaniac who could never get enough, Paul Goodman was quite right in thinking that he never had the attention he deserved. That comes out clearly enough in the obituaries I have read since his death, in the half-dozen American newspapers and magazines that I get here in Paris. In these obituaries, he is no more than that maverick, interesting writer who spread himself too thin, who published Growing Up Absurd, who influenced the rebellious American youth of the 1960s, who was indiscreet about his sexual life. Ned Roram's touching obituary, the only one I have read that gives any sense of Paul Goodman's importance, appeared in the Village Voice, a paper read by a large part of Paul Goodman's constituency, only on page 17. As the assessments come in now that he is dead, he is being treated as a marginal figure. I would hardly have wished for Paul Goodman the kind of media stardom awarded to McLuhan or even Marcuse, which has little to do with actual influence or even tells one anything about how much a writer is being read. What I am complaining about is that Paul Goodman was often taken for granted even by his admirers. It has never been clear to most people, I think, what an extraordinary figure he was. He could do almost anything, and tried to do almost everything a writer can do. Though his fiction became increasingly didactic and unpoetic, he continued to grow as a poet of considerable and entirely unfashionable sensibility. One day people will discover what good poetry he wrote. Most of what he said in his essays about people, cities, and the feel of life is true. His so-called amateurism is identical with his genius. That amateurism enabled him to bring to the questions of schooling, psychiatry, and citizenship an extraordinary, curmudgeonly accuracy of insight and freedom to envisage practical change. It is difficult to name all the ways in which I feel indebted to him. For 20 years, he has been to me quite simply the most important American writer. He was our Sartre, our Cocteau. He did not have the first-class theoretical intelligence of Sartre. He never touched the mad, opaque source of genuine fantasy that Cocteau had at his disposal in practicing so many arts. But he had gifts that neither Sartre nor Cocteau ever had: a genuine feeling for what human life is about, a fastidiousness and breadth of moral passion. His voice on the printed page is real to me as the voices of few writers have ever been: familiar, endearing, exasperating. I suspect there was a nobler human being in his books than in his life, something that happens often in literature. Sometimes it is the other way around, and the person in real life is nobler than the person in the books. Sometimes, as in the case of Sade, there is hardly any relationship between the person in the books and the person in real life. I always got energy from reading Paul Goodman. He was one of that small company of writers, living and dead, who established for me the value of being a writer, and from whose work I drew the standards by which I measured my own. There have been some living European writers in that diverse and very personal pantheon, but no living American writer apart from him. Everything he did on paper pleased me. I liked it when he was pig-headed, awkward, wistful, even wrong. His egotism touched me rather than put me off, as Mailer's often does when I read him. I admired his diligence, his willingness to serve. I admired his courage, which showed itself in so many ways, one of the most admirable being his honesty about his homosexuality in 5 years, for which he was much criticized by his straight friends in the New York intellectual world. That was 6 years ago, before the advent of gay liberation made coming out of the closet chic. I liked it when he talked about himself, and when he mingled his own sad sexual desires with his desire for the polity. Like André Breton, to whom he could be compared in many ways, Paul Goodman was a connoisseur of freedom, joy, pleasure. I learned a lot about those three things from reading him. This morning, starting to write this, I reached under the table by the window to get some paper for the typewriter and saw that one of the 2 or 3 paperback books buried under the manuscripts is New Reformation. Although I am trying to live for a year without books, a few manage to creep in somehow. It seems fitting that even here, in this tiny room where books are forbidden, where I try better to hear my own voice and discover what I really think and really feel, there is still at least one book by Paul Goodman around, for there has not been an apartment in which I have lived for the last 22 years that has not contained most of his books. With or without his books, I shall go on being marked by him. I shall go on grieving that he is no longer alive to talk in new books, and that now we all have to go on in our fumbling attempts to help each other, and to say what is true, and to release what poetry we have, and to respect each other's madness, and right to be wrong, and to cultivate our sense of citizenliness without Paul's hectoring, without Paul's patient meandering explanations of everything, without the grace of Paul's example. Susan Sontag, September 21, 1972.